Story 1. The Cabin That Wasn't There. Marcus Chen had been planning his solo hiking trip through the Great Smoky Mountains for 6 months. A software engineer from Charlotte, he'd spent 29 years in front of screens and decided it was time to reconnect with nature. He'd trained extensively, purchased top-tier equipment, and studied maps until he could navigate the trail system in his sleep. On October 15th, 2022, he set out on what should have been a 5-day journey along the Appalachian Trail's North Carolina section. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. Marcus maintained a steady pace, his GPS tracking perfectly with his paper maps. He passed other hikers occasionally, exchanging brief pleasantries before continuing on. The autumn foliage was spectacular, brilliant reds and golds painting the mountainsides. He camped at designated sites following leave-no-trace principles religiously. By the third morning, he felt a confidence he'd never experienced before, a sense of belonging in these ancient woods. That afternoon, clouds rolled in fast. Within 20 minutes, what had been a clear blue sky turned slate gray, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees. Marcus checked his GPS. He was still 3 miles from the next shelter. The first drops of rain hit just as he rounded a steep switchback. Within minutes, it became a downpour. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing as fog rolled up from the valleys below. He continued forward, knowing that stopping would only get him colder and wetter. Then he saw it through the rain, a cabin not marked on any of his maps. It sat about 50 yards off the trail, barely visible through the thick trees and rain. Marcus hesitated. He'd read about abandoned structures in the Smokies, remnants of communities that existed before the national park was established. Most were locked or unsafe, but as lightning cracked overhead and thunder rolled through the mountains, he made his way toward it. The cabin was smaller than it had appeared from the trail, maybe 15 feet by 20, but it looked solid, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The door hung slightly ajar. Marcus called out, waiting. No response. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, water streaming from his rain gear onto the wooden floor. The interior was pristine, not abandoned at all. A wood stove sat cold but clean in the corner. A simple table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. A narrow bed with a neatly made quilt stood against one wall. Shelves held canned goods, their labels faded but readable. Brands Marcus didn't recognize. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but nothing seemed weathered or decayed. It was as if someone had simply walked out one day and never returned. Marcus set down his pack, thinking he'd wait out the storm for an hour or 2. He checked his phone. No signal, which was expected. His GPS still functioned, and he noted the coordinates, planning to report the unlisted structure to park rangers. The storm intensified outside, rain hammering against the roof like thrown gravel. He was grateful for the shelter, even if the situation felt odd. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he noticed details that didn't quite fit. The wood stove was a modern design, maybe 20 years old, but the cabin's construction looked much older. Hand-hewn logs, wooden pegs instead of nails in places. The canned goods were a mix of ancient brands and ones he couldn't identify at all. One tin was labeled Moravian Peaches with a logo that looked like something from the 1930s. He walked to the small window and looked out. The forest seemed different, denser somehow. Trees pressed closer to the cabin than he remembered from his approach. Marcus rubbed his eyes, chalking it up to the rain and fog distorting his perception. He decided to make coffee with his camp stove to warm up. As water heated, he explored more carefully. A trunk at the foot of the bed contained old clothes. Simple work shirts and trousers, all hand-stitched. In a drawer of the table, he found a journal. The leather cover was worn smooth, the pages yellowed with age. Marcus opened it, seeing dates from 1937. Entries were written in careful script, documenting daily life. Weather, crops planted, game hunted. The writer's name appeared on the first page, property of Jeremiah Whitlock. Marcus read several entries, fascinated by this glimpse into Appalachian life nearly a century ago. But as he continued, the entries changed tone. Jeremiah began writing about seeing things in the woods, shadows that moved wrong, sounds that didn't match any animal he knew. He wrote about neighbors who'd disappeared, their cabins found empty with meals still on tables. About parts of the forest where compasses spun uselessly. About a feeling of being watched constantly. The final entry, dated November 3rd, 1937, made Marcus's hands shake. It's at the door now. Been scratching since sunset. I know I shouldn't let it in. It sounds like Mary, calls with her voice, but Mary's been gone 3 months. The thing out there ain't her. If whoever finds this journal gets caught in these woods after dark, remember, don't answer when it calls your name. Don't matter how familiar the voice sounds, it ain't who you think it is. Thunder crashed directly overhead and Marcus dropped the journal. When he picked it up, he noticed the last page had writing on the back, in different ink, fresher. October 15th, 2022. Waited out the storm here. Strange old place. Found a journal, creepy but probably fiction. Will report cabin location to rangers. That was today's date. Those were his thoughts, written in what looked exactly like his handwriting. Marcus's heart pounded as he flipped through the journal again. Throughout its pages, he now saw other entries, other dates spanning decades, different handwriting, different people, but all describing the same thing. Taking shelter in this cabin during storms, finding the journal, adding their own entries. The dates jumped erratically. 1963, 1989, 2004, 2016, all in October or November, all noting storms and strange feelings. He grabbed his GPS. The coordinates had changed, not drastically, but enough to notice. He was showing 3/4 of a mile from where he'd recorded the cabin's position an hour ago. Marcus rechecked his paper map, trying to triangulate his location by surrounding peaks. Nothing lined up correctly. The terrain visible through the window didn't match what should be there. Outside, the storm had stopped. Not gradually. It simply ended. Marcus looked out to see clear sky, stars already visible in the dusk. But it had been mid-afternoon when he entered. He checked his watch. 7:43 p.m. That was impossible. He'd been inside maybe 90 minutes. Panic rising, Marcus packed his gear with shaking hands. He needed to leave to get back to the marked trail. As he reached for the door handle, he heard it. His mother's voice calling from outside. "Marcus? Honey, are you in there? I've been so worried." His mother lived in Charlotte. There was no possible way she could be here, 6 hours away in the mountains, on a trail she'd never hiked. Marcus froze, hand on the door. "Marcus, please answer me. It's getting dark. I need help." Every instinct screamed at him to respond, to open the door. It sounded exactly like her, even had that particular catch in her voice when she was emotional. But he remembered Jeremiah's words from 1887. "I know you're in there, sweetheart. Won't you come help your mother?" Marcus backed away from the door, grabbing the journal. He scrawled quickly, "It's using my mother's voice. Don't open the door." He threw his pack on and moved to the rear wall, looking for another way out. The cabin was solid, no back door, no loose boards. The voice changed. Now it was his best friend Jake, then his sister, then a woman he dated briefly years ago, calling his name with increasing urgency. Each voice was perfect, capturing every nuance and inflection. Whatever was out there had access to his memories, his relationships. Hours passed. Marcus sat on the floor, pack ready, waiting for dawn. The voices continued, a rotation of everyone he'd ever cared about, each begging him to open the door to come outside to help them. Around 2 a.m. they stopped. The silence was somehow worse. As gray light finally filtered through the window, Marcus approached the door carefully. He could see the porch was empty. Opening the door slowly, he stepped out, moving quickly away from the cabin and crashing through the underbrush toward where the trail should be. He found it after 10 minutes of desperate searching. The familiar white blazes of the Appalachian trail had never looked so beautiful. Marcus ran, not stopping until he reached the next shelter 3 miles north, where he found 2 other hikers preparing breakfast. They confirmed the date, the location, everything. He'd lost one night. When rangers investigated based on his coordinates, they found nothing. No cabin, no clearing, just dense old-growth forest. The GPS coordinates Marcus had recorded didn't correspond to any structure in their database. They suggested he'd been disoriented by the storm, maybe found a rock overhang and hallucinated the details. But Marcus still has the journal. He pulled it from his pack that morning, thinking he'd imagined the whole thing. It's real, physical, filled with entries spanning over a century. He's read them all now. 47 people took shelter in that cabin, spanning from 1887 to 2022. Only 33 made it out to write their warnings. The last 14 entries end the same way, in different handwriting. I opened the door. Marcus donated the journal to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy's archives, though they filed it under folklore and fiction. He finished his hike the next day, checking out early. He never went back to the Smokies, never solo hiked again. Sometimes, late at night, he still hears his mother's voice calling from outside his apartment window, asking him to please come help her. He keeps the windows locked and the curtains drawn. In the archives, filed away and forgotten, the journal waits. Its pages have room for many more entries. The cabin is still there, somewhere in the shifting hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, waiting for the next storm, the next lost hiker who needs shelter. And on its porch, something patient practices voices, adding new ones to its collection with every person who passes nearby. Marcus checks the news sometimes, reading about missing hikers in the Smokies. Most are found. Some aren't. He wonders how many found the cabin, how many heard the voices, and how many opened the door. The mountains keep their secrets hidden in mist and shadow, and the cabin that isn't there waits for those who wander too far from the marked trail. Story 2. The Mine That Goes Too Deep. Sarah Vance grew up in Thurmond, West Virginia, a ghost town that had seen better days when coal was king. Her great-grandfather had worked the mines before they closed in the 1950s, and she'd grown up on his stories of the deep places beneath the mountains. Now 34 and a freelance journalist, she'd returned in September of 2023 to write a piece about abandoned mining communities. She had permission from the state to explore and photograph several sealed mine entrances for her article. The Blackwood mine had been closed since 1952, its entrance sealed with concrete and steel bars. According to records, 17 miners had died in a collapse in its deepest shaft, their bodies never recovered. The mine had been abandoned immediately after, the company simply walking away. Sarah had obtained the old mine maps from the State Geological Survey, complex documents showing a labyrinth extending nearly 2 miles into the mountain. She arrived at the site with professional spelunking gear, a helmet-mounted camera, and a healthy respect for the danger. The official seal had been broken, vandals or curious locals probably. The bars had been pried open enough for a person to squeeze through. Sarah documented this, taking photos before entering. She'd filed her itinerary with the county sheriff and carried a satellite beacon for emergencies. The entrance tunnel was exactly as the maps showed, 8 feet high, reinforced with rotting timber and rusted rail tracks still visible under decades of sediment. Sarah moved carefully, testing her footing constantly. Her headlamp cut through darkness that felt solid, revealing limestone walls weeping moisture. The temperature dropped quickly, settling at a constant 52 degrees. Water dripped somewhere ahead, a metronome counting down into the mountain's depths. 200 yards in, she found the first chamber. This would have been a staging area where miners assembled before heading to active dig sites. Broken equipment remained scattered about: ancient pickaxes, a collapsed cart, helmets with carbide lamps. Sarah photographed everything, taking notes on her digital recorder. The air smelled of minerals and decay, that peculiar underground scent of stone and time. The map showed the main shaft continuing deeper, branching into multiple tunnels at the half-mile mark. Sarah followed the central passage, marking her route with chalk arrows every 50 feet. Her GPS showed signal loss, expected this deep, but her compass worked fine, and she'd practiced navigation without technology. At the branching point, she paused. The maps indicated the collapse had occurred in the eastern tunnel, about 300 yards further. That's where the 17 miners had died, where the company had simply sealed everything rather than attempt recovery. Sarah felt obligated to document it, to put faces to the tragedy through her article. She had photos of the miners from historical society records, young men, most of them with families depending on their wages. The eastern tunnel narrowed considerably. Sarah had to remove her pack and drag it behind her in places. The timber supports here looked unstable, sagging under the mountain's weight. She moved quickly, wanting to reach the collapse site and return to wider passages. Her breath came faster, and she reminded herself to stay calm, to breathe slowly. Panic was the real danger underground. Then she heard it, the sound of picks striking stone, rhythmic and steady, echoing from somewhere ahead. Sarah froze. There couldn't be anyone else down here. The mine had been closed for 71 years. But the sound continued, metal on rock, a pattern that suggested multiple workers. She moved forward cautiously, rounding a bend. The collapse site appeared suddenly, a wall of broken stone and timber filling the tunnel completely. But that wasn't what made Sarah's blood run cold. On the other side of the cave-in, clearly visible through gaps in the rubble, lights moved. Carbide lamps, their distinctive yellow glow unmistakable. And with the lights, shadows of men working, picks rising and falling. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice strange and flat in the confined space. "Is someone there?" The sound stopped. Silence filled the tunnel, broken only by water dripping somewhere behind her. Then from the other side of the collapse, a voice answered. "Who's there?" "This is a working mine. No civilians allowed." The voice sounded strange, the accent thick. Old-time Appalachian, the kind Sarah had heard only in historical recordings. She moved closer to the rubble, peering through a gap. On the other side, the tunnel was pristine, its timber supports new and strong. Rail tracks gleamed as if freshly laid. And standing there, staring back at her, was a man in work clothes from another era. Canvas overalls, a chambray shirt, heavy boots. His face was young, maybe 25, covered in coal dust. He held a pickaxe, looking confused and somewhat frightened. "Who are you?" he asked. "How'd you get on the other side?" I'm Sarah Vance. I'm documenting the mine. It's been closed since 1952. Who are you?" The man's confusion deepened. "Closed?" "Ma'am, we're working. It's September 8th, 1952. We've been digging this shaft for 3 weeks now." He turned, calling back. "Hey, foreman, we got someone trapped on the other side." More lights appeared, more men. Sarah counted them through the gaps, 17 in total. 17, just like the records. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, checking the date. September 8th, 2023. Exactly 71 years to the day after the collapse. "Listen," Sarah said, her mouth dry. You need to leave this tunnel. Right now. There's going to be a collapse today. All of you will die if you don't leave." The men looked at each other, then back at her. The first one, whose name tag read Whitaker, stepped closer to the rubble. "Ma'am, I think you hit your head. This tunnel is solid. We test everything. Been mining these mountains for generations." "Please," Sarah begged. "Check the date. Look at my equipment. Does this look like 1952 to you?" She held up her phone, its screen glowing. The miners stared at it, uncomprehending. Of course, they'd never seen anything like it. She activated her helmet camera, showing them the LED light. "This is from the future. From your future. You're all in the records. The collapse happens at 2:15 this afternoon. You have to leave." Whitaker's face had gone pale. "You're saying we're ghosts? That we're already dead?" "No," Sarah said desperately. "You're not dead yet. Not if you leave now. Please, there's still time." One of the other miners, older, stepped forward. "Let's say we believe you, which I don't. But let's say, why are you here? How are you talking to us through solid rock?" Sarah didn't have an answer. The collapse was supposed to be complete, impenetrable. Yet she could see them clearly, could hear every word. It was as if the mountain itself had thinned between times, allowing this impossible connection. "I don't know how," she admitted, "but it doesn't matter. You need to trust me and leave. Now." The foreman, an older man with a thick mustache, made the decision. "Boys, we're taking an early lunch. Head back to the entrance." He looked at Sarah. "I don't know what this is, but I'm not risking my crew on a shaft that someone says is gonna collapse." Relief flooded through Sarah as the miners began gathering their tools. They moved away, their lights receding. Whitaker lingered, staring at her through the gap. "If what you're saying is true, thank you. I got a wife and a baby girl at home." "Go," Sarah urged. "No, don't look back." He nodded and turned, hurrying after the others. Their lights faded into the distance, the sound of their boots echoing and then falling silent. Sarah checked her watch. 1:45 p.m. If the records were accurate, the collapse would occur in 30 minutes. She should leave too, should get out of this tunnel before whatever had created this temporal thinning happened again. But she waited, needing to know if she'd changed anything, if those men would make it out. At 2:10 p.m., she heard voices echoing from the far side, angry voices. Then the foreman appeared alone, his lamp bright through the gaps in the rubble. "They sent me back," he called to Sarah. "The superintendent wants to know why we're taking an unscheduled break. Says we'll lose a day's pay if we don't get back to work. The boys are scared, but they got families to feed. They're coming back down." "No!" Sarah screamed. "Don't let them. You can't let them come back down here." "I tried," the foreman said, and his voice sounded defeated. "But you tried telling hungry men they can't work because a woman in the walls told you the future. They think I've lost my mind." Sarah watched in horror as lights appeared again, the miners returning. They moved past the foreman, picking up their tools, resuming their work. Whitaker wouldn't look at her, shame and fear on his young face. But his family needed the money. They all needed the money. At 2:14 p.m., Sarah heard it, a deep groan from within the mountain, a sound like the earth itself shifting. The miners heard it too. They stopped, looking up at the ceiling. Whitaker's eyes found hers through the gap, wide with understanding and terror. "Run!" the foreman screamed. They tried. Sarah watched them drop their tools and sprint toward the entrance, their lights bouncing wildly. But the mountain had already made its decision. The groaning intensified, became a roar. Timber cracked like gunshots. Then, with a sound that Sarah would hear in her nightmares forever, the ceiling came down. The tunnel on the other side disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. The gaps in the rubble sealed completely as new rock poured down. Sarah stumbled backward, coughing in the dust that somehow filtered through from 71 years ago. When it settled, the wall before her was solid and impassable. She could hear them on the other side, screaming at first, then calling for help, digging frantically. Their carbide lamps flickered visible through new tiny gaps, and Sarah pressed her hands against the rock, feeling vibrations of their desperate work. "Help is coming!" she shouted, knowing it was a lie. "Hold on!" But help wouldn't come, not in 1952. The company would seal the mine instead, calling it too dangerous for recovery operations. 17 families would receive a pittance in compensation. The men would die in the dark, their bodies entombed forever in the mountain. For hours, Sarah listened to them. She recorded everything, tears streaming down her face. She heard them pray. She heard them dictate messages for their families, asking her to pass them on. She wrote down every word. She heard them sing hymns as their lamps failed one by one. She heard them comfort each other as the air grew thin. At 9:37 p.m., she heard the last voice. Whitaker. "Tell my daughter I'm sorry I won't see her grow up. Tell my wife I love her. And thank you for trying. I know you tried." Then silence. Absolute and final. Sarah remained there for another hour but heard nothing more. The temporal connection, whatever had caused it, had closed. She was alone in a dead tunnel with 17 men lying forever on the other side of that rubble in a time she couldn't reach. Sarah made her way out, navigating by chalk marks in a daze. She emerged at 2 a.m., sitting down outside the mine entrance and finally allowing herself to break down. She called the sheriff, tried to explain, but how could she? They'd think she was insane. Her article was never published. Instead, Sarah spent the next year tracking down the descendants of those 17 miners. Most had left West Virginia long ago, scattered across the country. She found them one by one, delivering the messages she'd recorded. Some believed her. Most didn't. But Whitaker's daughter, now an elderly woman living in Florida, cried when Sarah played the recording of her father's last words. "I always wondered," the old woman said. "Always hoped he hadn't suffered. Now I know he thought of us at the end. That's something." Sarah never returned to the Blackwood mine, but every September 8th, she lights 17 candles in her apartment, one for each miner. She tried to save them and failed, bound by the laws of time and the weight of the mountain. The mine entrance has been resealed, welded shut permanently. But sometimes hikers in the area report hearing something strange on September 8th. The sound of picks striking stone echoing up from deep within the mountain. And very rarely on that specific date, someone will see lights moving in the depths of Blackwood Mine, carbide lamps glowing like distant stars, still working the shaft that became their tomb. The mountain remembers its dead, holding them in stone and shadow, replaying their final day across the boundary of years. Sarah knows now that some places in the Appalachian Mountains exist outside normal time, where past and present blur together like mist in the hollows. The deep places hold more than darkness and stone. They hold moments, preserved and repeated, tragedy looping forever through rock and earth. She tried to break that loop, to change what had already happened. But the mountain was stronger, and the dead remain where they fell, forever working, forever dying, forever waiting for a salvation that will never come. Story 3. The town that isn't on any map. Dr. Rebecca Torres had been driving for 6 hours when she realized something was deeply wrong. A cultural anthropologist from the University of Tennessee, she'd been researching isolated Appalachian communities for her dissertation. In November of 2021, she'd received an intriguing letter at her office, handwritten on old paper, postmarked from Greystone, VA. The letter described a small town in the Blue Ridge Mountains that had maintained its traditional way of life, completely isolated from modern society. It was perfect for her research. The problem was that Greystone didn't exist. Not on modern maps, not on GPS, not in census records or county databases. Rebecca had initially dismissed the letter as a hoax, but something about the handwriting, the specific details of mountain customs described, felt authentic. She'd decided to investigate, using the rough directions included in the letter. Take Route 211 west from Sperryville. Turn at the old millstone marker. Follow the unnamed road into the mountains. She'd found the millstone marker easily enough. An ancient stone post carved with a mill wheel symbol, dating back centuries. The unnamed road was there too, barely visible, 2 ruts overgrown with weeds. Her Subaru handled the rough terrain well enough, climbing steadily into increasingly remote mountains. Cell service had died an hour ago. GPS showed her as driving through blank space. The road wound through dense forest, autumn leaves falling like rain. Rebecca saw no houses, no other roads, no signs of human habitation. Just as she was about to turn back, the trees opened up and she saw it. Greystone sat in a small valley surrounded by steep mountain ridges on all sides. Perhaps 200 buildings, houses, shops, a church with a tall steeple, all built in a style from another era. Smoke rose from chimneys. People walked the dirt streets dressed in simple clothes that looked handmade. Children played in yards. Gardens showed the remains of summer vegetables. It looked like a living museum, a community from the 1800s somehow preserved into the 21st century. Rebecca parked at the edge of town near a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Greystone, established 1842. She grabbed her camera and notebook, excitement overriding her nervousness. This was exactly what she'd hoped to find, an isolated community maintaining traditional Appalachian culture. As she walked down the main street, people stopped to stare. Not hostile exactly, but intensely curious. An elderly man sweeping a porch nodded politely. A woman hanging laundry paused to watch her pass. Children whispered to each other, pointing at Rebecca's modern clothes and vehicle. The general store seemed like a good starting point. Rebecca pushed open the door, a bell jingling overhead. The interior smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and aged paper. Shelves held goods that looked handcrafted, pottery, woven baskets, jarred preserves. A man behind the counter, perhaps 60 years old, looked up from a ledger he was writing in with the actual quill pen. "Good afternoon," Rebecca said, offering her most disarming smile. "My name is Dr. Rebecca Torres. I'm a researcher from the University of Tennessee studying Appalachian communities. I received a letter inviting me to visit Greystone." The man studied her for a long moment. "Did you now? And who sent this letter?" "It wasn't signed. I was hoping to find out who it was from to thank them." The man closed his ledger carefully. "We don't get many visitors. In fact, we don't get any visitors." "How did you find the road?" "The directions were in the letter." "Is there someone I could speak with about your community? An elder or mayor? I'd love to learn about your history." The storekeeper's expression was unreadable. "You should speak with Elder Morton. His house is the large one by the church, white with black shutters." "But Dr. Torres," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Be mindful of the time. You'll want to leave before nightfall." "Why?" Rebecca asked, but the man had already turned away, busying himself with arranging jars on a shelf. She found Elder Morton's house easily. An elderly man answered her knock, his face lined with age but his eyes sharp and intelligent. When she explained her purpose, he invited her in, seating her in a parlor that looked like something from a period drama. "I must confess," Elder Morton said, "I wrote that letter. We've been aware of you for some time, Dr. Torres. Your research into Appalachian isolation, your respectful approach to traditional cultures." I thought perhaps you could help us. Help you how? The old man sighed deeply. First, let me tell you our history. Greystone was established in 1842 by families fleeing persecution for their beliefs. We came to these mountains seeking isolation, self-sufficiency. For generations we thrived, but something happened in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. He stood walking to a window overlooking the town. The disease reached us despite our isolation. We lost half the town in 3 months. In desperation, our elder at the time, my great-grandfather, performed an old ritual, something passed down through the families. A protection, a way to seal the town away from the outside world and its dangers. Rebecca took notes, fascinated. What kind of ritual? The kind that worked, Elder Morton said quietly. Too well, perhaps. The influenza stopped, but so did everything else. Dr. Torres, what year do you think it is here? 2021, November. For you, yes. For Greystone? It's November 3rd, 1918. Every day. We wake up, live through November 3rd, and wake up again to the same day. The same weather, the same sun position, the same everything. We remember each repeat, each cycle. We've lived this day thousands upon thousands of times. Rebecca's pen stopped moving. That's not possible. Says the woman who drove to a town that doesn't exist on any map through forest that shouldn't contain a road. Elder Morton turned to face her. We are trapped, Dr. Torres, frozen in time by our own desperate prayer for protection. The ritual sealed us away from the world, but it sealed us too completely. Nothing ages, nothing changes. We cannot die. Some have tried in despair, but they simply wake up again on November 3rd, whole and healthy. We cannot leave. The few who've attempted to walk out never return, and yet we find them here each morning with no memory of what happened. Rebecca's rational mind struggled with this information, but she couldn't deny what she was seeing. The town's perfect preservation, the absence of anything modern, the strange behavior of the storekeeper. Why contact me? What can I do? We hoped that someone from outside might break the cycle. The ritual required an elder to seal the town. Perhaps it requires an outsider to unseal it. I am asking for your help, Dr. Torres, to free us from this endless day. The old man led her to the church, into a basement that served as a meeting hall. Other townspeople gathered there, maybe 50 in total. They all had the same look in their eyes, a weariness beyond words, the exhaustion of living the same day for over a century. Elder Morton showed her the ritual space, a circle carved into the stone floor, symbols Rebecca didn't recognize, but that looked ancient, predating even the town's establishment. The ritual must be performed at midnight, he explained. You must stand in the center and speak words that reverse the protection. We've worked for decades to discover them, combining fragments of old knowledge. He handed her a paper with words written in a language she didn't recognize, old Germanic perhaps, mixed with Latin and something else entirely. You must speak these as the church bell strikes midnight. If it works, the protection will break, and we'll be free to move forward in time again. Rebecca looked at the gathered faces, men, women, children who'd lived November 3rd, 1918 for over a century of subjective experience, who'd watched loved ones die of flu and wake healthy the next morning over and over, who'd lost their connection to the changing world, trapped in a single autumn day. I'll try, she said, but if this breaks, you'll suddenly be in 2021. The world will be completely different. We know, Elder Morton said. We've prepared as best we can. Some fear the change, but most of us would rather face an uncertain future than continue in this eternal present. They waited as the day progressed, Rebecca learning the town's rhythms, hearing stories of the endless repeat. One woman had memorized over 500 books from memory, having read the same small library countless times. A man had learned to carve incredible sculptures, having had thousands of days to perfect his technique. Children who should have grown old remained young, playing the same games, learning the same lessons again and again. As midnight approached, the townspeople gathered in the church. Rebecca stood in the ritual circle, the paper shaking in her hands. The symbols around her seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, though that might have been her imagination. The church bell began to chime. On the first strike, Rebecca started reading the words, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made her hair stand on end. On the sixth strike, the symbols definitely began glowing, pulsing with each word she spoke. At the 10th strike, something pushed back. Rebecca felt resistance, as if the ritual itself was fighting to maintain its hold. The townspeople felt it too, gasping as pressure built in the air. Elder Morton urged her to continue, his voice barely audible over a rising wind that shouldn't exist inside a closed church. On the 12th strike, Rebecca spoke the final word. The world twisted. Reality seemed to bend around the ritual circle, and Rebecca felt herself falling, though she remained standing. The church disappeared, replaced by swirling darkness filled with screams. The screams of everyone who'd ever tried to leave Greystone, she realized with horror, trapped forever in the space between the town and the outside world. Then, with a sound like thunder, everything snapped back. Rebecca collapsed, gasping. The townspeople cried out in joy and terror. Through the church windows, they could see the sky changing, clouds moving, stars wheeling overhead at impossible speed. Time was catching up. Rebecca stumbled outside, watching as decades compressed into minutes. The buildings aged before her eyes, paint peeling, wood weathering, some structures collapsing. Graves appeared in the cemetery, marking deaths that had occurred but been reset by the ritual. Trees grew, leaves fell, snow came and melted over and over in rapid succession. When it stopped, Greystone was a ruin. Most buildings had collapsed from a century of deferred decay hitting all at once. The church stood, but barely, and the townspeople. Some had survived the transition. Elder Morton stood next to Rebecca, but he was now impossibly old, his body finally aging as time caught up. He smiled, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you," he whispered, and then he crumbled to dust, along with several other elderly residents. Their bodies had lived far beyond natural span, sustained only by the ritual's stasis. Of the 200 people Rebecca had met that day, perhaps 40 survived. The youngest, those whose bodies could handle the sudden progression of time. They stood in shock, looking at the ruins of their town, the graves of neighbors who'd died during the endless loop, free but devastated. Rebecca helped them as best she could. She drove several survivors down the mountain to the nearest town, where authorities struggled to believe the story. The survivors had no modern identification, no records of existence. Legally, they'd never been born. Social services eventually classified them as undocumented immigrants, placing them in foster care or shelters. Rebecca returned to Greystone 3 days later with a team from the university. The town was still there, but barely. Already, nature was reclaiming it. More disturbingly, in the basement of the church, the ritual circle had reactivated. Symbols glowed faintly, and the space inside felt waiting. One of her colleagues stepped into the circle to take measurements. He disappeared, simply vanished mid-step. They searched for hours, but found no trace. That night, as they camped in the ruins, Rebecca heard his voice calling from the church basement. When she investigated, she saw him standing in the circle, looking confused. "What happened?" he asked. "I just stepped in." "Tom, you've been gone for 8 hours." He checked his watch. No, it's been maybe 10 seconds. Time was still broken in Greystone. The ritual had been reversed, but something remained, a wound in reality that the town's century-long temporal stasis had created. The university sealed the site and the government declared it a hazardous area. But hikers still occasionally find the old millstone marker, still follow the overgrown road to a valley that shouldn't exist. Some return to tell stories of ruins in the mountains, of voices calling from a collapsed church, of figures in old-fashioned clothes asking what year it is. Others don't return at all. Rebecca checks the missing persons reports regularly, her guilt growing with each disappearance. The survivors of Greystone adapted to modern life with varying success. Most preferred to stay together, forming a small community in Tennessee. They refused to speak about their time in the loop, the psychological impact of living the same day for subjective centuries. Several have taken their own lives, unable to cope with a world that moves forward. Elder Morton's body, what remained of it, was never found. Forensics suggested the dust had blown away, but Rebecca knows better. Sometimes when she reviews her recordings from that night, she hears his voice beneath the ritual words she'd spoken, thanking her repeatedly. An echo trapped in the audio like he'd been trapped in time. The millstone marker was removed by the state, the road officially closed. But roads in the Appalachian Mountains have a way of remaining even after they're erased from maps. People still find their way to Greystone, drawn by curiosity or letters that arrive from nowhere, written in handwriting from another century. Rebecca burned her dissertation research. She never completed her doctorate, never published her findings. Some knowledge, she decided, shouldn't be shared. The ritual's words remain in her possession, locked in a safety deposit box with instructions to destroy them upon her death. But she wonders if that will matter. The words had been preserved in Greystone for over a century. They're probably written elsewhere, waiting to be found by desperate people seeking protection from a dangerous world. In the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a valley that maps don't show, ruins of a town continue to decay. But if you visit on November 3rd, locals say the ruins look different, newer, whole. They say smoke rises from chimneys that have collapsed, and children's laughter echoes from houses that no longer stand. The protection ritual failed, but Greystone remains somehow still trapped in its endless day, still seeking salvation from someone who doesn't understand the price of breaking time itself. Rebecca will never return to find out. She'd freed the town and destroyed it in the same act, and the weight of that contradiction haunts her more than any supernatural phenomenon. She'd succeeded in her mission and failed these people utterly, granting them the future they'd begged for while erasing their past. The town that isn't on any map is perhaps better left that way. A cautionary tale written in stone and sorrow, hidden in the mountains where time itself has learned to break. Story 4. The forest that rearranges itself. Tyler Morrison had been a park ranger in the Pisgah National Forest for 11 years before October of 2023. When he started noticing the trees were moving, not swaying in wind, moving, changing position. As a professional outdoorsman, Tyler prided himself on his observational skills and perfect sense of direction. He knew these trails like his own living room, could navigate them blindfolded. So when he started finding landmarks in the wrong places, he initially thought something was wrong with him. It started small. A distinctive lightning-struck oak that should have been 50 yards from the Avery Creek Trail appeared 200 yards away instead. Tyler checked his maps, thinking he'd misremembered, but the GPS confirmed it. He was exactly where he thought he was. The tree had moved, or he'd always been wrong about its location. The next week, a trail shelter that had stood in the same clearing for 20 years was simply elsewhere. Tyler found it half a mile from its mapped location, as if it had always been there. The concrete foundation remained where the shelter should be, but the structure itself had relocated. His supervisor suggested vandals had dismantled and reassembled it as a prank, but the building was anchored in concrete footings that showed decades of weathering. Tyler started documenting everything with photographs and GPS coordinates. A waterfall that flowed north suddenly flowed south. A rocky outcrop that offered spectacular views of Mount Pisgah appeared on the opposite side of the trail. Bridges crossed streams that had changed course overnight. Each time the forest looked completely natural, as if it had always been that way. Only Tyler's photos and GPS data proved otherwise. His colleagues thought he was losing his mind. His supervisor suggested stress leave, but Tyler knew what he was seeing was real, impossible as it seemed. The forest was changing, rearranging itself, and he was the only one who noticed because he was the only one paying attention. He decided to conduct an experiment. On October 15th, Tyler hiked deep into a remote section of the forest following a trail he'd walked hundreds of times. He marked his route meticulously, tying bright pink ribbon to trees every 20 yards, creating an unmistakable path. He took photos of each marked tree, noting their GPS coordinates. Then he hiked out and waited. 2 days later, he returned to check his markers. The ribbons were still there, but they no longer formed a straight line. The trees he'd marked had moved, creating a path that curved and doubled back on itself in ways that defied geometry. According to GPS, some markers had shifted hundreds of yards from where he'd placed them. Yet the ribbons were still securely tied, the trees showing no signs of having been uprooted and moved. Tyler sat down in the middle of this impossible path, fear finally overcoming his scientific curiosity. The forest wasn't just rearranging. It was rearranging around humans, responding to their presence somehow. He was in danger, though he couldn't articulate how or why. That night, camping in a backcountry site he'd used dozens of times, Tyler woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of wood groaning. Not wind in branches, but the deep groan of massive trunks under stress. He unzipped his tent and stepped out into moonlight that filtered through the canopy. The trees were moving. He could see it now in real time. Massive oaks and hemlocks sliding slowly through the earth like ships. Through water, their roots somehow mobile, repositioning themselves. The entire forest was in motion, a slow dance of wood and earth that transformed the landscape as he watched. Tyler grabbed his backpack and ran, heading for what should have been a fire road half a mile away. But as he ran, the forest changed around him. Trees slid into his path, forcing him to detour. Clearings closed like doors shutting. The trail he followed twisted into a labyrinth. He checked his compass, but the needle spun uselessly, unable to find north in this shifting landscape. He ran for hours, his headlamp illuminating a forest that wouldn't let him leave. Every time he thought he'd found the way out, the trees rearranged, creating new barriers. Tyler realized with mounting horror that the forest was hurting him, guiding him deeper into itself, to some destination it had chosen. At dawn, exhausted and terrified, he stumbled into a clearing he'd never seen before. In its center stood a massive hemlock, easily 6 feet in diameter, its branches spreading over an area the size of a house. The tree looked ancient, possibly centuries old, its bark scarred and weathered. And around its base, scattered in the leaf litter, were items: backpacks, boots, cell phones, camping equipment. Personal effects from dozens of people dating back years based on their weathering. Tyler approached slowly, documenting everything with his camera. Some items were recent, a smartphone from the last few years. Others were older, a rotary dial camping compass, boots from the 1960s, even a hunting rifle that looked early 1900s. All were weathered but not decayed, preserved somehow by the forest. He found a journal in a waterproof bag, its pages still readable. The entries were from 1987, written by a hiker named David Pritchard. Tyler read with growing dread. Day 4 in the forest, can't find my way out. The trees move when I'm not looking. I mark paths, but they rearrange. Food almost gone. Why is this happening? Later entries became more desperate, less rational. Day 10, saw others here. Dead people, I think. They walk among the trees like they belong. They don't speak, just watch me. The forest is alive, it's hungry. It wants us to become part of it. The final entry was barely legible. Day 14, too weak to walk. The tree in the clearing calls me. I can feel it in my mind, inviting me to rest. I'm so tired. Maybe I'll just lie down beneath it just for a minute. Tyler looked at the massive hemlock, seeing it differently now. What he'd taken for gnarled bark patterns looked from a certain angle like faces. Human faces, dozens of them, stretched and distorted but unmistakably human. The tree wasn't just old, it was fed. He ran, not caring which direction, just needing to escape that clearing. The forest resisted, trees sliding into his path, branches seeming to reach for him. Tyler crashed through undergrowth, fell down, slopes, forced his way through thickets that shouldn't exist in this part of the forest. His clothes tore, blood ran from scratches, but he didn't stop. Then, impossibly, he heard voices, a family hiking, talking about lunch plans. Tyler scrambled toward the sound, breaking through a final wall of laurel into a scene of shocking normalcy. A maintained trail, a family of 4 with a dog, wearing day hiking clothes and carrying a small cooler. "Help!" Tyler gasped. "Help me, please!" The family stared at this wild-eyed man in torn ranger uniform, emerging from off-trail like a madman. But the father, seeing Tyler's genuine distress, helped him to sit, offering water. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Tyler wanted to explain about the moving forest, the impossible clearing, the tree that consumed people. But looking at their concerned, rational faces, he realized how insane he'd sound. He was a park ranger, supposed to be the expert, the one who kept others safe. How could he tell them the forest itself was alive and malevolent? "Got turned around," he said finally. "Disoriented. Thank you." They helped him to the trailhead, clearly thinking he'd had some kind of breakdown. Maybe he had. Tyler checked his GPS at the parking lot. He'd somehow traveled 7 miles from where he'd camped, even though he'd run mostly in circles. The family departed with backward glances, probably planning to call his supervisor. Tyler requested and received medical leave, citing stress and exhaustion. During his month away, he researched obsessively. He found dozens of missing persons reports from Pisgah National Forest over the years. Hikers who vanished completely, their bodies never recovered despite extensive searches. The numbers were higher than other comparable parks, statistically anomalous. He found old newspaper articles from the 1800s about haunted woods in the area, places where people claimed the trees moved and the paths changed. Native American legends spoke of forests that were sacred and dangerous, places where the boundary between the living and spirit worlds was thin, where the trees themselves were conscious and jealous of their territory. When Tyler returned to work, he was assigned to office duty. His supervisor clearly doubted his fitness for backcountry patrol. But Tyler used his access to review search and rescue records. He mapped every missing person report over the last 50 years, looking for patterns. They were there. The disappearances clustered around specific areas, creating a rough circle deep in the forest. At the center of that circle, according to his calculations, would be the clearing with the ancient hemlock. The tree fed and the forest delivered meals to it, rearranging its paths to trap the unwary. Tyler tried to warn people. He wrote reports, filed formal concerns, requested that certain areas be closed. His supervisor grew increasingly impatient, eventually suggesting Tyler seek psychological help. No one else had experienced the moving forest. No one else found the trails changing. To everyone but Tyler, Pisgah was a normal, if somewhat challenging, woodland. He went back one more time in November of 2023 with a plan. If the forest was alive, if it consciously trapped people, maybe he could negotiate. It sounded insane even to him, but he had to try. Tyler hiked into the deep forest, intentionally getting lost, waiting for the trees to herd him. They did. By nightfall, he found himself in the clearing once again. The ancient hemlock stood like a dark pillar against the sunset sky, its face-marked bark seeming to watch him. The scattered belongings of the consumed had multiplied. Fresh items from recent victims. Tyler approached the tree, placing his hand on its rough bark. "I know what you are," he said aloud, feeling foolish but committed. "I know you're aware, I know you feed, but why? Why do you need to trap and consume people?" The response didn't come in words, but in feelings, images that formed directly in his mind. He saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, vast and unmolested, covering these mountains in unbroken green. He felt its awareness, its slow consciousness that operated on timescales humans couldn't comprehend. He understood that the forest wasn't evil. It simply was, operating according to laws different from human morality. The hemlock was the heart, the center of the forest's consciousness. It had grown for perhaps 1,000 years, slowly becoming aware, slowly developing the ability to influence the trees around it. And it was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely in a way that transcended human understanding. The people it took weren't food exactly, they were company absorbed into the tree itself, their consciousness joining with its vast, slow mind. Tyler felt the invitation, the same pull that David Pritchard had described in his final journal entry. It would be easy to simply lie down, to rest, to let the tree absorb him. His exhaustion from months of stress and fear made the offer tempting. Peace, belonging, becoming part of something ancient and powerful. The tree promised all of this. But Tyler also saw something else. The horror of the absorbed minds trapped forever in the tree's consciousness, unable to die or escape, aware but powerless. It wasn't the peace the tree promised. It was an eternal imprisonment, experiencing time at the tree's glacial pace, centuries passing while consciousness remained intact and screaming. "No," Tyler said, pulling his hand away. "No, I won't join you. And I'll warn others. I'll tell everyone who'll listen about this place." The forest's response was immediate. Trees slid closer, surrounding the clearing. Branches lowered, reaching. Tyler ran, the forest fighting him with every step. Trees blocked his path, roots rose to trip him, branches grabbed at his clothes and hair. The forest had lured and herded before, but now it actively attacked, desperate to keep him. Tyler fought through it, using every bit of his training and knowledge. He ignored the compass, ignored the trails, and navigated by the stars visible through gaps in the canopy. He used his knife to mark trees as he passed, creating a trail the forest couldn't erase fast enough. He ran through the night, the forest groaning and shifting around him until finally, as the sun rose, he burst onto a paved road. A passing motorist found him collapsed on the roadside, delirious with exhaustion. He spent 3 days in the hospital, diagnosed with severe dehydration and exposure. When he tried to explain what happened, psychiatric services were called. Tyler was deemed unfit for duty and forced into early retirement on medical disability. But he'd escaped with proof. His camera contained hundreds of photos showing trees in different positions, GPS coordinates that made no geometric sense, images of the clearing and its terrible tree. He published everything online, creating a detailed warning about specific areas of Pisgah National Forest to avoid. Most dismissed it as the ravings of someone who'd suffered a mental breakdown, but some believed. Hikers began avoiding the areas Tyler marked, even if they couldn't articulate why. Missing persons reports from that section of the forest dropped significantly over the following year. Tyler monitors it still, tracking every missing person report, every unexplained disappearance. The forest remains hungry and the hemlock continues its slow, patient wait. But fewer people feed it now, and Tyler hopes that someday it will wither, its consciousness fading back into ordinary wood and leaf. He lives near the forest's edge now, unable to leave completely. Sometimes at night, when wind moves through the trees, he hears voices in the rustling leaves. The absorbed souls calling to him, begging him to join them or pleading for rescue he cannot provide. The tree remembers him, the one who escaped, who refused its offer. And the forest itself remembers, rearranging its paths in ways that might someday lead Tyler back to the clearing. He keeps his knife sharp, his compass close, and he never hikes alone anymore. The Appalachian mountains hold many mysteries, but few as conscious and patient as the forest that rearranges itself, guided by a tree that has learned to hunger for more than water and sunlight. It hungers for consciousness, for company in its eternal lonely existence, and it will wait, reshaping the woods, creating labyrinths for the unwary, for as long as trees can grow and roots can shift through the ancient mountain earth. Story 5. The Hiker Who Came Back Wrong. Jennifer Park had been missing for 6 days when she walked out of the Shenandoah National Park wilderness in August of 2022. Her wife, Michelle, was at the Search Command Center when rangers radioed that Jennifer had been found walking down a fire road near Dark Hollow Falls. Michelle drove there immediately, her relief overwhelming. The search had consumed nearly a week, with dozens of volunteers combing the backcountry. Jennifer had simply vanished from a day hike on an easy trail. But when Michelle arrived and saw her wife standing there smiling, something felt wrong. She couldn't identify what exactly. Jennifer looked perfectly fine. No injuries, clothes barely dirty, not dehydrated or malnourished despite 6 days in the wilderness. She hugged Michelle, said all the right things, answered the ranger's questions appropriately. Yet Michelle felt a creeping unease, a primal instinct that something was deeply off. "Where were you?" Michelle asked in the car driving home. "We searched everywhere. Everyone was so worried." Jennifer smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "I got turned around, wandered off trail, found a cave to shelter in, lost track of time. I'm sorry I worried everyone." The explanation was plausible but vague. Michelle pressed for details. What did she eat? How did she stay warm during the cold nights? How did she suddenly find her way back to a trail after 6 days lost? "I don't really remember," Jennifer said, still smiling that strange smile. "It's all kind of fuzzy. I must have been more disoriented than I thought." Over the next days, Michelle's unease grew into certainty that something was profoundly wrong. Jennifer moved differently. Her gait was subtly off, like someone learning to walk in a body they didn't quite fit. She held objects strangely, gripping her fork like she'd never used one before, having to think about how to open doors. Her sleep pattern changed completely. Michelle would wake at 3 a.m. to find Jennifer standing at the bedroom window, simply staring out at the dark woods behind their house for hours. Food was another issue. Jennifer had been vegetarian for 15 years, but now she craved raw meat. Michelle found her in the kitchen at 2 a.m. eating ground beef directly from the package, blood running down her chin. When confronted, Jennifer seemed confused about why this was wrong. "I was hungry," she said, looking at the raw meat in her hands as if seeing it for the first time. The most disturbing changes were subtler. Jennifer's speech patterns shifted, becoming more formal, like someone who'd learned English academically rather than natively. She forgot personal memories they'd shared, Their wedding, their honeymoon, the names of close friends. When Michelle showed her photos from their life together, Jennifer studied them like historical documents rather than personal mementos. "That's us," she'd say, pointing at a picture. "We look happy." "We are happy," Michelle corrected. "Jen, what's going on? You're scaring me." Jennifer's smile never wavered. "Nothing is wrong. I'm home. Everything is fine." But everything wasn't fine. Michelle's friends noticed the change too. Jennifer's co-workers reported that she seemed different, distant, struggling with tasks she'd previously performed expertly. Her boss privately asked Michelle if Jennifer had suffered a head injury during her time lost. Michelle insisted on medical evaluation. The doctors found nothing wrong. Physically, Jennifer was in perfect health, better than before, actually. She'd lost no weight despite 6 days without proper food. Her vitals were excellent. CT scans and MRI showed no brain abnormalities. Psychologically, she passed basic cognitive tests, though the psychiatrist noted she seemed oddly detached, as if viewing her own life from the outside. Michelle began researching obsessively. She found cases of people who'd survived traumatic experiences emerging with personality changes, dissociative disorders, PTSD. But none quite matched what she was seeing. Jennifer wasn't traumatized. She seemed completely unbothered by her ordeal. She simply wasn't quite herself anymore. 3 weeks after Jennifer's return, Michelle found her in the backyard at dawn, standing perfectly still in the center of the lawn, face tilted toward the rising sun. When Michelle approached, Jennifer didn't move or acknowledge her presence. Michelle touched her shoulder and Jennifer jumped violently, as if startled by the concept of touch. "What were you doing?" Michelle asked. "Listening," Jennifer said. "The morning is loud here." "Loud? Jen, it's silent. The neighbors aren't even awake yet." Jennifer cocked her head, an eerily inhuman gesture. "There are birds, insects, small mammals in the brush, the trees moving, so much noise." That afternoon, Michelle went to the Shenandoah Park Ranger Station, asking to speak with whoever led the search for Jennifer. A ranger named Thomas Blackwood met with her, and Michelle poured out her concerns. Her wife had returned but wasn't herself. Something was fundamentally wrong. Blackwood listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious. When Michelle finished, he sat back, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Park, I need to tell you something confidential. You're not the first person to report this. Over the past 20 years, we've had 17 people go missing in the backcountry and later return. When they do, family members usually report personality changes. We've documented it but kept it quiet to avoid panic." Michelle felt her blood run cold. "What's causing it?" "We don't know. Search and rescue has theories. Everything from prolonged isolation causing psychological breaks to exposure to natural toxins affecting brain chemistry. But between us, none of those explanations feel adequate. The changes are too consistent, too specific. People come back physically fine but fundamentally altered, like there's someone else wearing the person's body," Michelle finished. Blackwood nodded grimly. "We've had families request medical examinations, psychiatric evaluations, even genetic testing. Nothing shows up as abnormal. Legally, they're the same person, but the families know they aren't." "What happens to them? The people who come back wrong?" "Most families learn to adapt, accepting the new version of their loved one. Some relationships end. You can't force intimacy with someone who's essentially a stranger. A few cases, the changed person simply left, walking back into the wilderness. We never saw them again." Michelle felt tears building. "How do I get her back? My actual wife?" "I don't think you can," Blackwood said softly. "I'm sorry. Whatever happened to her in those 6 days, wherever she actually was, the Jennifer Park who went into those woods didn't come out? This is someone, something else. That night, Michelle couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to Jennifer, watching her wife's chest rise and fall with breathing that seemed too regular, too perfect. In sleep, most people shifted position, made small noises, twitched as they dreamed. Jennifer lay completely still, like a mannequin arranged to look sleeping. Michelle got up quietly, going to her office to review everything she knew. Jennifer had been hiking the Hawksbill Summit Trail, one of the most popular and well-maintained in the park. She texted Michelle at 10 a.m., saying she'd reached the summit and was heading down. That was the last anyone heard from her. Search dogs tracked her scent off trail into dense forest, then lost it completely near an area of limestone caves. Searchers had explored the caves but found no trace. On impulse, Michelle called Ranger Blackwood, catching him at home. The caves where her scent disappeared, were any of the other changed people found near there? Silence on the line then. Hold on, let me check records. Michelle heard papers shuffling, keyboard clicking. Jesus, yes, 11 of the 17, the others were from different areas, but... Wait. Looking at topography, there are cave systems near all the disappearance sites. They might connect underground. What's in those caves? We've explored them. They're just caves, limestone formations, some underground streams. Nothing unusual was found. But you didn't go deep enough, Michelle said, certainty building. You explored the accessible areas. Whatever changed them is deeper in parts you haven't reached. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. Even if you're right, what can we do? We can't exactly mount an expedition into unmapped cave systems based on speculation that something is stealing people's identities. But Michelle was already planning. She'd been caving before, had taken a weekend course years ago. She could do this. She had to know what had taken her wife. The next day, while Jennifer was at work, going through the motions of her job like an actor playing a role, Michelle drove to Shenandoah, parking near the trail where Jennifer had disappeared. She had climbing equipment, powerful headlamps, rope, and supplies. She'd left a letter for Jennifer, the thing that looked like Jennifer, explaining where she'd gone and why. She hiked to the area where search dogs had lost the scent, finding the cave entrance easily enough. A narrow opening between rocks, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Michelle squeezed through, descending into cold darkness. The cave system was extensive, tunnels branching in multiple directions. Michelle followed the largest passage, marking her route with chalk arrows. Water dripped constantly, the sound echoing strangely. She descended for what felt like hours, her watch showing she'd gone much deeper than any recreational cave system should go. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, her headlamp unable to find the far walls or ceiling. And in the center of this space stood structures, not natural formations but carved stone pillars arranged in concentric circles. The carving style was unlike anything Michelle had seen, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, seeming to shift and move in the light. Between the pillars, figures stood motionless. Michelle approached carefully, her light revealing human shapes perfectly still. As she got closer, her breath caught. They looked like people, exact duplicates of people, but wrong in the same subtle ways Jennifer was wrong. They stood like statues, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, further back in the darkness. Some wore hiking clothes from recent years. Others wore styles from decades past. Michelle walked among them, examining faces. She recognized some from missing persons reports she'd researched, people who'd vanished in these mountains over the years, never found. But these weren't the actual missing people. These were copies, she realized, duplicates waiting to be activated and sent back to replace the originals. A sound behind her made Michelle spin around. Jennifer stood there. The original Jennifer, Michelle knew instantly. This version had terror in her eyes, dirt and tears on her face, clothes torn from 6 days of actual survival. She looked at Michelle with desperate recognition. "Michelle, oh God, you're real, you're actually here." They embraced, and Michelle felt the difference immediately. This was her wife, the woman she knew, not the stranger wearing Jennifer's face. "What is this place?" Michelle asked. "What happened to you?" "I fell," Jennifer said, words tumbling out. "There was a sinkhole on the trail, hidden by leaves. I fell into a tunnel, ended up down here. I've been trying to find a way out, but the caves just go on forever. And there are things down here, Michelle. Things that watch and study us. They took my image, copied me somehow. I saw it happen. They made a duplicate while I was unconscious. It woke up and walked out, walking with my face, my body, but it wasn't me. It came home," Michelle said. "It's been living our life. It's convincing, Jen, but I knew you were wrong." A sound echoed through the cavern, footsteps, many of them coming from the tunnels. The duplicates were activating, drawn by noise or light or the presence of humans who didn't belong. They emerged from the darkness, dozens of them, all wearing the faces of the missing. They moved in uncanny unison, surrounding Michelle and Jennifer. The duplicates didn't speak, didn't attack. They simply stood there, observing with eyes that held curiosity but no humanity. Michelle realized these things were studying them, learning how to better mimic human behavior. Every interaction improved their disguise. She grabbed Jennifer's hand. "We're leaving, now!" They ran, Michelle following her chalk arrows back toward the entrance. Behind them, the duplicates followed at a walking pace, not pursuing exactly, but escorting them out, as if satisfied they'd learned enough. Michelle and Jennifer climbed desperately, scrambling up tunnels that grew smaller and steeper. When they finally squeezed through the entrance opening into afternoon sunlight, both women collapsed on the mountainside, gasping and crying. They were out. They were safe. But as they stumbled toward Michelle's car, Jennifer stopped. "The duplicate that looks like me. It's at our house. In our life." Michelle nodded grimly. "We'll deal with it. We'll prove you're you, and that thing is an imposter." But proving it was impossible. When they went to the police, bringing Jennifer, the real Jennifer, they found themselves facing the duplicate, who'd already filed a missing person report on Michelle. To everyone else, the duplicate was Jennifer Park, with her ID, her fingerprints, somehow, her DNA, impossibly. The real Jennifer had no way to prove her identity when confronted with a perfect copy. The duplicate looked at them with that strange, flat affect. "I don't know who this woman is, but she's not me. She's clearly delusional, possibly dangerous." The police, faced with two identical women both claiming to be Jennifer Park, made a decision based on documentation and behavior. The duplicate had proof of identity, a job, a consistent story. The real Jennifer was dirty, hysterical, raving about caves and monsters. They asked Michelle who her actual wife was. Michelle looked between them, the duplicate calm and composed, and Jennifer exhausted and terrified, but unmistakably herself. "Her," Michelle said, pointing to the real Jennifer. "She's my wife." But legal identity won. The duplicate was Jennifer Park, according to all records. The real Jennifer was classified as a disturbed individual experiencing delusions, possibly suffering from dissociative identity disorder. She was held for psychiatric evaluation while Michelle frantically tried to prove the truth. It was hopeless. The duplicate was too perfect, too thoroughly documented. Eventually, real Jennifer was released but barred from contact with Michelle or their shared home. The duplicate had filed a restraining order. Michelle violated it immediately, meeting with real Jennifer at a motel. "We can't win this, legally," Michelle said. "The system recognizes it as you. We need another approach." They considered going public, but who would believe them? Ranger Blackwood agreed to write a statement about the pattern of changed people returning from the park, But it wasn't enough. The duplicate had effectively stolen Jennifer's life, and there was no way to take it back. In the end, they simply left. Michelle and real Jennifer moved to Oregon, starting over under Michelle's maiden name. They left behind Jennifer's job, their house, their shared life, all of it claimed by the duplicate that wore Jennifer's face. Back in Virginia, the duplicate lives Jennifer's life with eerie competence. It learned from its initial mistakes, becoming increasingly convincing. Michelle's friends and family accepted it as Jennifer, attributing any lingering oddness to trauma from being lost. The duplicate works Jennifer's job, pays Jennifer's bills, and to all external observation is Jennifer Park. But sometimes hikers in Shenandoah report seeing a woman who looks like Jennifer standing near trail entrances at dawn, perfectly still, watching people begin their hikes. Rangers have approached her several times, but she always walks away into the forest, disappearing before they can reach her. Security cameras at trailheads occasionally catch her in frame, standing motionless for hours before vanishing. Michelle monitors missing persons reports from the area. The pattern continues. People disappear for days, then return changed. Their families usually don't report it publicly, but Michelle has connected with several through support groups. They share stories, trying to understand what the duplicates are, where they come from, why the caves beneath the mountains produce perfect copies of people who get lost. One theory suggests the caves hold something ancient, something that existed long before humans that learned to mimic us for purposes unknown. Another proposes they're some kind of testing ground, that the duplicates are being studied before being released into human society. Michelle doesn't know which, if any, is true. What she knows is that her wife came back from those mountains, and the woman she loved was replaced by something that wears her face perfectly but isn't her. That the real Jennifer survived and escaped, but lost her identity to a copy that the world accepts as genuine. That somewhere beneath the Appalachian mountains in caves that go deeper than any map shows, something creates duplicates of the lost, improving them with each iteration, learning to be more human than humans themselves. And Michelle knows that the duplicates are still out there, walking out of the wilderness, taking places in society, wearing stolen faces. She can spot them sometimes. That slight wrongness in movement, that flat quality behind the eyes. She sees them in crowds occasionally, always alone, always watching and learning. The mountains keep their secrets, and whatever dwells in the deep caves continues its work, patient and methodical. More hikers disappear, more changed people return, and families across Appalachia whisper among themselves about loved ones who came home wrong, about the copies that took their places, about the truth that no one official will acknowledge. That something in these ancient mountains has learned to mimic humanity and is slowly, carefully replacing us one lost hiker at a time. Story 6. The hunting cabin in the wrong place. Nathan Edwards had inherited the hunting cabin from his grandfather in March of 2023, along with 30 acres of remote land in the West Virginia hills. He'd visited the property once as a child, 25 years earlier, but barely remembered it. His grandfather's will included detailed directions. The cabin wasn't on any county maps, accessible only via a private logging road that branched from State Route 40. Nathan drove out from Columbus, Ohio in early November, planning a solo weekend to assess the property. He found the logging road easily enough, his truck handling the rough terrain as he climbed into increasingly isolated hills. The directions indicated 7.2 miles on this road, then a left turn at a rock formation resembling a bear's head. He found the landmark, a boulder that did look remarkably like a bear when viewed from the right angle, and turned onto an even rougher track, little more than 2 tire ruts through dense forest. His truck's GPS showed blank space, no roads or structures recorded. Cell service had died an hour ago. After another 3 miles, the cabin appeared, a small structure of weathered logs with a stone chimney, exactly as his grandfather had described. Nathan parked and approached, key in hand. The place looked abandoned but intact, shutters closed, door sealed. He unlocked it and stepped inside. The interior was perfectly preserved, frozen in time. Dust covered everything, but the furniture remained where his grandfather had left it. A wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bunk bed. Shelves held supplies, canned goods from decades past, kerosene for lamps, basic tools. No electricity or plumbing as expected. A hand pump well stood outside. This was a genuine backcountry hunting cabin, the kind men of his grandfather's generation had maintained for yearly deer seasons. Nathan spent the afternoon cleaning, sweeping out dust and mouse droppings, checking for damage. The structure was solid, roof intact, windows unbroken. As evening fell, he got the wood stove going, heating water for coffee. The isolation was profound. Not a single human-made sound reached him, just wind through trees and occasional bird calls. As darkness settled completely, Nathan lit a kerosene lamp. The cabin's glow felt warm and inviting, a bubble of humanity in the vast Appalachian wilderness. He ate dinner from his cooler, planning the next day's exploration of the property. He wanted to find the tree stands his grandfather had mentioned, see the boundaries, decide if he'd keep the land or sell it. Around 9 p.m. he heard an engine, a vehicle approaching on the logging road. Nathan felt a flash of concern. This was private property, miles from the nearest house. Who else would be out here? Headlights appeared through the trees and a pickup truck pulled into the clearing. 2 men got out, both wearing hunting clothes. They approached the cabin, calling out, "Hello? Anyone home?" Nathan went to the door, opening it cautiously. "Can I help you?" The older man, maybe 60, smiled. "Sorry to bother you. We're camped about a mile down the ridge, saw your light. Haven't seen another hunter in this area in years. Thought we'd say hello, maybe share information about deer movement." Something felt off, but Nathan couldn't identify what. The men seemed friendly, normal. Their truck looked ordinary, their gear typical hunting equipment. "I'm not hunting," Nathan said. "Just checking on the cabin. It belonged to my grandfather." "James Edwards?" the younger man asked. "Your grandfather was James Edwards? You knew him?" "Sure, hunted with him a few times back in the day. Good man. Sorry for your loss. Heard he passed last year." They chatted for a while, Nathan learning that these men, Carl and his son David, had been hunting these woods for decades. They offered advice about the property, mentioned the best spots for deer, warned about areas where the terrain got dangerous. "One thing," Carl said as they prepared to leave. "Don't go northwest from here. There's an area maybe 2 miles through the woods where things get strange. Your grandfather knew about it, always avoided it." "Strange how?" Nathan asked. "Hard to explain. Land doesn't feel right there, compasses don't work proper, easy to get turned around. We lost a dog in there once. She just vanished, never found her. Just stay east and south of the cabin, you'll be fine." They departed, their tail lights disappearing down the logging road. Nathan went back inside, troubled. The encounter had been normal enough, but something nagged at him. He couldn't place it until he was lying in the bunk bed trying to sleep. The truck. Carl's truck had been a 1990 Ford F-150 in remarkably good condition for its age. But not good condition like a restored vehicle. Good condition like a relatively new truck. No rust, no dents, paint fresh. It had looked how that model would have looked in the mid-90s, not how a 30-year-old truck should look. And their clothes. Hunting gear from the same era. Styles and brands that hadn't been current in 20 years. Even their speech patterns seemed slightly off, like people from an earlier time. Nathan sat up, heart pounding. He pulled out his phone, checking the date and time. November 3rd, 2023, 10:47 p.m. But something felt wrong about that. He tried his phone's camera, taking a picture of the cabin interior. The image looked strange, slightly blurred, as if reality itself wasn't quite in focus. He went to the window, looking out at the clearing. In the distance, he could see a faint glow. Carl and David's camp, presumably. But the light looked wrong, too orange, flickering like firelight rather than modern LEDs. Nathan grabbed his grandfather's journal from a shelf. He'd noticed it earlier among the supplies. He opened it, reading entries from hunting seasons past. The dates jumped around: 1995, 1998, 2002. Descriptions of successful hunts, weather conditions, wildlife observed. Then he found an entry that made his blood run cold. November 3rd, 1995. Something wrong with the cabin this year. Met two hunters, Carl and David, who claimed to have hunted with me before. Don't remember them. They knew details about my life I hadn't shared. Time feels wrong here. Need to investigate the northwest area they warned about. Something is happening on this land. The next entry was dated 3 years later. November 3rd, 1998. The cabin has shifted again. Met Carl and David, same as before. They look exactly the same age, wearing the same clothes. They don't remember meeting me previously. The cabin is in a time loop of some kind, centered around November 3rd. Each visit I arrive on this date, regardless of when I think I'm coming. Need to break the cycle. Nathan flipped through more entries, all dated November 3rd across different years. His grandfather had figured out something was wrong but kept returning, kept trying to understand. The final entry was from November 3rd, 2022, just days before his grandfather's death. My last visit. Too old to keep doing this. The cabin exists in a bubble, repeating November 3rd endlessly. I think it's connected to something in the northwest area, something old and powerful that warps time. To whoever inherits this property, probably Nathan, be careful. The cabin isn't where or when it seems. Once you're here, you're trapped in the loop until you can find the source and break it. I never did. Good luck. Nathan checked his watch again. Still November 3rd, but now showing 11:15 p.m. He'd lost track of time reading. Or had he? He looked at his phone, same time. But he'd been reading for what felt like an hour. He tried the door. It opened easily, but when he stepped outside, the night felt wrong. The stars were in different positions than they should be. The moon showed a phase it hadn't been when he arrived. And in the distance, Carl and David's campfire glowed, looking exactly as it had before. Nathan grabbed his truck keys and walked to his vehicle. He started it, relieved when the engine turned over. He'd drive out, escape whatever this was. But as he headed down the logging road, his headlights illuminated familiar terrain. After what should have been miles, he arrived back at the cabin, approaching it from the same direction he'd tried to leave. He tried again, taking different turns, following different paths through the forest. Each time, after 20 minutes of driving, he arrived back at the cabin. The property existed in a spatial loop as well as a temporal one. As dawn broke, or seemed to, Nathan noticed something else strange. The light didn't progress properly. It stayed at perpetual dawn for what felt like hours, the sun never fully rising. November 3rd wasn't just repeating. It was stuck, time moving in circles rather than forward. Remembering his grandfather's notes about the northwest area, Nathan packed a day pack with supplies and his compass. He'd investigate, find the source of this anomaly, and hopefully break the cycle. As he set out, Carl appeared from the woods, looking concerned. "Didn't think you'd go that direction," Carl said. "Nothing good there." "When are you from?" Nathan asked. "What year?" Carl looked confused. 1995? What do you mean? It's 2023, or it was when I got here. That's crazy, it's 95, November 3rd. Nathan left Carl standing there, hiking northwest through dense forest. His compass spun uselessly, confirming his grandfather's notes. He navigated by the sun's position, or the unchanging dawn light's position. The terrain grew rougher, rocky outcrops appearing more frequently. After 2 hours, he found it, a clearing containing a ring of standing stones clearly very old, weathered almost smooth. They weren't natural formations, too regular, too deliberately placed. In the center of the ring lay a perfectly circular depression in the ground, about 6 feet across, filled with water that reflected the sky perfectly despite the dawn light. Nathan approached carefully, peering into the water. His reflection looked back at him, but wrong, showing him at different ages simultaneously, child and adult and elderly all at once. And behind his reflection, the water showed other times, the forest as it had been decades ago, centuries ago, before human settlement. The standing stones glowed faintly, pulsing with a rhythm like a slow heartbeat. This was the source. This place was causing the time loop, probably had been for far longer than his grandfather's hunting cabin had existed. The cabin just happened to be built within its range of influence. Nathan remembered stories he'd researched about Appalachian mysteries. Tales of places where time worked differently, where European settlers had found stone circles erected by peoples who'd vanished long before. These stones predated Native American habitation, ancient beyond reckoning. He knelt at the depression's edge, reaching toward the water. When his fingers touched its surface, reality lurched. Nathan found himself standing in the same spot, but the forest around him was different. Older, taller trees, no trail. A figure stood on the opposite side of the depression. A Native American man dressed in traditional clothes, staring at Nathan in shock. "You see me?" the man asked in accented English. "Yes. Who are you?" "I am Onawa. I came here in the time of my grandfather's grandfather. I am trapped, same as you will be. This place," he gestured to the stones, "was made by the old ones before my people, before your people. It was meant to preserve, to hold moments forever, but it became corrupted, broken. Now it traps instead of preserves." "How do I break it?" Nathan asked desperately. "The stones must be toppled, the ring broken, but I could never do it. I have no physical strength here, only presence. I am a ghost of November 3rd from my time. You are real. You can do what I could not." Nathan looked at the stones. They were massive, probably weighing tons each. But he had tools in his truck, a jack rope, his grandfather's old come-along winch. It would take time and effort, but it might be possible. "If I break it, what happens to you?" Onawa smiled sadly. "I am freed. I move forward finally to whatever comes next. This place has held me for more lifetimes than I can count. Please, break the circle. Free all of us trapped in its loops." Nathan returned to the cabin, the journey taking half the time despite him not hurrying. Time was completely meaningless in this place. He loaded equipment into his pack, then stopped. Carl stood by the cabin, looking worried. "You're going to break it, aren't you?" Carl asked. "The thing that keeps us here. You know about it? Known for years, but never could figure out how to end it. If you break the circle, we all move forward. For me, that means moving forward from 1995. I'll suddenly appear in whatever year it actually is, won't I?" "Probably, I'm sorry." Carl shook his head. "Don't be. This half-life isn't living. Do it, set us free." Nathan hiked back to the standing stones, using GPS on his phone to mark the route, though he suspected the technology was meaningless in this warped space. At the stone circle, he began working on the smallest standing stone, digging around its base, creating leverage with his tools. It took hours. or what felt like hours. The sky remained at eternal dawn, time refusing to pass. But Nathan kept working, exhausting himself until finally the stone shifted. With a groan like the earth itself protesting, it toppled, crashing to the ground. The effect was immediate. The remaining stones began cracking, splits appearing in their ancient surfaces. The water in the depression began to drain away, spiraling down into the earth. The pulsing light intensified, then flickered out completely. Reality lurched violently. Nathan felt himself pulled forward through time, decades passing in seconds. He saw the forest grow and change, seasons cycling rapidly, the cabin appearing and aging and being maintained. He saw his grandfather at different ages, saw Carl and David aging in rapid progression, saw Onawa finally fading into light and disappearing. Then everything snapped back to normal. Nathan stood in the clearing, the stones now cracked and fallen, no longer maintaining their circle. The water was gone, just dry earth where the depression had been. And the light was moving properly now, the sun rising as it should on what his watch confirmed was November 3rd, 2023, at approximately 8:30 a.m. He'd lost time, or gained it. However the loop had worked, he'd experienced subjective hours while objective time moved differently. Nathan stumbled back toward the cabin, exhausted. When he arrived, he found his truck where he'd left it, everything normal. The supernatural weight that had pressed on the clearing was gone. Carl and David were gone too. Nathan hoped they'd found themselves suddenly in their proper times, able to continue their lives. He never saw them again. Nathan stayed at the cabin one more night, genuine night this time, with darkness that progressed to dawn naturally. In the morning, he packed up and drove out, following the logging road without any spatial loops. He made it home without incident. He kept the property but never used the cabin again. Too many memories, too much strangeness. He did research the stone circle, finding similar formations across Appalachia, all associated with time distortions and disappearances. Most had been destroyed over the years, but a few remained, still warping time in isolated pockets of the mountains. Sometimes Nathan wonders about Carl and David appearing suddenly in 2023 from 1995, decades out of place. He checked local news for reports of confused hunters but found nothing. Perhaps they'd integrated somehow, or perhaps the loop had released them differently than he imagined. The hunting cabin remains accessible to anyone who can find it. But the temporal anomaly is gone, broken when Nathan toppled those ancient stones. The land is normal now, just 30 acres of West Virginia forest. Yet hikers in the area sometimes report strange experiences, finding themselves on November 3rd regardless of what date they think it is, meeting people in outdated clothes who don't know what year it is, or discovering they've lost time without explanation. Time doesn't heal properly in places where it's been broken. The stones are gone, the loop supposedly ended, but reality remains scarred there. The Appalachian mountains are old beyond human comprehension, and in their depths lie remnants of peoples and powers that shape time itself. Nathan had found one such place and broken it, but he knows others remain, scattered through the endless hills, waiting for unsuspecting visitors to stumble into moments that repeat forever. Traps of time built by vanished hands for forgotten purposes. Story 7. The Mine Worker Who Never Left. Isabel Martinez moved to Lynch, Kentucky, in September of 2022 to document the town's coal mining history for her doctoral thesis in industrial archaeology. Lynch was a company town, built entirely by United States Coal and Coke Company in 1917. Abandoned when the mines closed in 1982. Most buildings stood empty now. The population dropped from thousands to barely 200 permanent residents. It was perfect for Isabel's research on Appalachian industrial decline. She rented a small house on the edge of town, next to the abandoned mine superintendent's home, a grand Victorian that had once housed company officials. Isabel spent her days photographing structures, interviewing elderly former miners, and exploring the massive mining complex that dominated the hillside. The scale of the operation was staggering. Miles of tunnels, enormous tipples where coal had been sorted, housing for thousands of workers. Now it was all rust and rot, nature slowly reclaiming what industry had built. 3 weeks into her residency, Isabel began noticing movement in the abandoned superintendent's house. Lights in the windows after dark, shadows passing behind curtains. She assumed squatters or teenagers using the place, but when she mentioned it to her landlord, the old man's face went pale. "What kind of lights?" he asked. "Yellow, flickering. Probably candles or lanterns." "Should I call the sheriff?" "No," he said firmly, "and don't do that. Don't go over there either, just ignore it." Isabel was puzzled by his reaction but let it drop. However, her curiosity grew as the lights appeared every night, always in the same upstairs window. She began documenting them, taking photos, noting times and patterns. The lights appeared at exactly 8 p.m. each evening, flickered for roughly 2 hours, then went out. On October 12th, she saw him, a man in the window wearing what looked like formal clothes from the 1920s. He stood perfectly still, staring out at the mine complex. Isabel grabbed her camera, zooming in. The man's face was visible but strange, his features somehow indistinct despite her camera's high resolution. He remained motionless for 10 minutes, then stepped back from the window, disappearing. Isabel's research had included reviewing town records, and she'd found photographs of the superintendent's house from its occupied period. She pulled these up, comparing them to what she'd photographed. The room layout was identical, down to the position of furniture visible in the window. It was as if the house's interior had been frozen in time. Against her landlord's warning, Isabel decided to investigate. On October 15th at noon, when sunlight made everything feel safer, she approached the Victorian house. The front door was chained shut, windows boarded up on the ground floor. She circled the building, finding a basement entrance that hung open, its lock rusted away. Inside, her flashlight revealed a basement full of coal storage bins, now empty. A wooden staircase led upward, steps creaking alarmingly under her weight. She emerged into the main floor, a grand entrance hall with a sweeping staircase, everything covered in decades of dust and decay. Water damage had destroyed plaster walls. Furniture remained rotted and collapsed. The place smelled of mildew and abandonment. But as Isabel climbed to the second floor, the decay lessened. The upper hallway was dusty but intact, no water damage, furniture in better condition. She found the room she'd seen from outside, a study or office with a massive desk, bookshelves, and a chair positioned by the window. This room looked almost preserved, as if someone had cleaned it recently. On the desk lay papers, their ink unfaded. Production reports from Portal 31 mine, dated October of 1937. Isabel picked one up carefully. The paper felt fresh, not brittle like it should be after 85 years. Handwriting covered the pages, noting daily coal tonnage, worker assignments, safety violations that needed addressing. A company ledger sat open, its pages filled with names and numbers. Isabel recognized some names from her interviews, grandfathers and great-grandfathers of people she'd spoken with. The entries detailed wages paid, company store charges deducted, amounts sent to workers' families. The superintendent had kept meticulous records of every transaction. Then Isabel heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy boots on hardwood approaching steadily. She froze, heart pounding, realizing she was trespassing and could be confronted by security or police. But the footsteps sounded wrong, too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone marching rather than walking. The study door, which she'd left open, swung shut with a bang. Isabel spun around, seeing no one. But the temperature dropped instantly, her breath suddenly visible. The desk lamp, which hadn't been on, which couldn't be on in a house without electricity, flickered to life, casting yellow light identical to what she'd photographed from outside. A man appeared in the chair by the window, not appearing like someone walking into view, but materializing. One moment absent, the next sitting there as if he'd always been sitting there. He wore a dark suit from the 1920s or 30s, his face angular and stern. He stared out the window at the mine complex, just as Isabel had seen him do every night. 16 tons short today, he said without looking at her. Portal 31 is underperforming. The workers are slowing production deliberately. They think I don't notice. Isabel couldn't move, couldn't speak. The man radiated wrongness, a feeling of existing outside normal reality. He turned to face her, and his eyes were empty. Not blind, but literally empty, dark voids where eyes should be. "You're the new documentation specialist," he continued, his voice emotionless. "You need to record this information. The company requires accurate reports." He gestured at the papers on the desk. "These production numbers are unacceptable. We must increase efficiency." "Who are you?" Isabel managed to whisper. "Thomas Harrington, mine superintendent, United States Coal and Coke Company." He spoke as if reading from a script, his tone never varying. "You are?" "Isabel Martinez. I'm a researcher. This mine closed 40 years ago." Harrington's expression didn't change. "Closed? Impossible. We have contracts to fulfill. The war effort requires coal. We cannot close." He stood, walking to a wall map that showed the mine's tunnel systems. "Portal 31 needs reinforcement in Section 7. Schedule that for tomorrow's shift, and dock the pay of workers in Section 4. They're 15% below quota." Isabel realized she was talking to something that wasn't entirely human anymore, if it ever had been. This wasn't a simple haunting. Thomas Harrington was trapped, endlessly replaying his role as superintendent, unable to comprehend that the mine had closed, the company dissolved, the entire industrial empire he'd served long gone. "Mr. Harrington," she said carefully, "well, what year is it?" He consulted a calendar on the wall, a calendar that showed October 1937. "October 15th. We're approaching winter. Production must increase before weather impacts operations. It's 2022. The mine closed in 1982. You're not alive anymore." For the first time, Harrington's rigid demeanor cracked. His empty eyes fixed on her with something like confusion. "Not alive? That's absurd. I have work to complete. The company depends on me." But his voice carried uncertainty now, a tremor in his previously emotionless tone. Isabel took a risk, pulling out her phone and showing him photographs she'd taken of the abandoned mine. Collapsed buildings, rusted equipment, nature reclaiming everything. Harrington stared at the images, his face contorting through expressions of confusion, denial, and growing horror. "What happened?" he whispered. "Well, where is everyone? Where are my workers?" "They're gone. Retired, moved away, passed on. The mine became unprofitable. The company left. That was 40 years ago." Harrington collapsed into his chair, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I don't remember dying. I remember working, always working. Reports and quotas and safety inspections and contract fulfillment. Every day, the same work. I thought—" He trailed off, lost. "How long have you been here?" Isabel asked. "Today is October 15th, 1937. No, it's October 15th, 2022. You've been repeating the same day for 85 years. The supernatural lights in the study flickered. Harrington's form grew less substantial, wavering like a projection. "I can't leave," he said, desperation entering his voice for the first time. I tried once, but the mine needs me. The reports must be filed, the workers must be managed. I have responsibilities. Isabel understood then. Harrington hadn't just died here. He'd trapped himself, his sense of duty and obligation binding him to this place long after death. He'd defined himself so completely by his work that he couldn't exist without it. The mine had closed, but its superintendent remained, forever filing reports no one would read, managing workers who no longer existed. You can leave, Isabel said gently. The mine doesn't need you anymore. No one needs you to work. You've done enough. You can rest. Rest? Harrington's empty eyes seemed to focus on something distant. I haven't rested since... I don't remember when. The company promoted me to superintendent in 1925. I've worked every day since, every single day, even after I died. When did you die? October 15th, 1937. Heart attack at my desk. I remember the pain falling forward onto these papers, but then I was standing up again, looking at production reports, and I had work to finish. So I continued. The work never ends. He'd been trapped in the moment of his death for 85 years, Isabel realized, repeating his final workday endlessly, unable to move forward, unable to accept that his responsibilities had ended. Mr. Harrington, the mine is closed. The company is gone. You have no more obligations. You're free to go. His form flickered more violently, the study's walls becoming visible through his translucent body. Free? I don't know how to be free. I only know how to work. Isabel thought quickly. Then I'm giving you a final assignment. As a researcher documenting this mine's history, I'm officially relieving you of duty. Your work here is complete. Your final task is to leave this place and move on to whatever comes next. That's an order. Harrington stood, pulling himself into a rigid posture like a soldier receiving commands. Relieved of duty, he repeated. Final assignment, departure. He looked around the study, seeing it properly, perhaps for the first time in decades. This room. I died here. I've been here ever since, haven't I? Filing the same reports, managing the same workers, checking the same quotas. October 15th, 1937, repeated infinitely. Yes, but it's over now. You can go. The superintendent walked to the window, looking out at the abandoned mine complex one final time. I gave everything to this company, my health, my time, my life. And they just left. Walked away when it stopped being profitable. All those workers, all those families dependent on this mine. Abandoned. A lot of people suffered when the mines closed, Isabel said. But that's not your burden to carry. You did your job. It's time to rest. Harrington nodded slowly. His form was barely visible now, fading in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. Thank you for telling me. For releasing me. I've been so tired. So very tired. He turned to face her one last time. Document this place well. Remember the people who worked here, lived here, built their lives around these mountains and this coal. Don't let us be forgotten. I won't, Isabel promised. That's what my research is for. Thomas Harrington smiled, a genuine human expression, the first she'd seen from him, and then he was gone. Simply vanished, like smoke dispersing. The study immediately felt different, lighter, no longer weighted with supernatural presence. The papers on the desk crumbled to dust, finally aging the 85 years they should have. The lamp went dark, unpowered. Isabel left the superintendent's house shaking but satisfied. She'd helped free a trapped soul, something she'd never expected to do in her academic research. That night, no lights appeared in the window. The house stood dark and silent, finally just an abandoned building rather than a prison for the dead. She completed her thesis work, documenting Lynch's history thoroughly. In her dissertation, she included a chapter about the human cost of industrial abandonment, not just economic, but psychological. The way people like Thomas Harrington had defined themselves so completely by their work that they couldn't exist without it. She didn't mention his ghost directly, but those who read between the lines could sense what she'd encountered. Lynch continues its slow decline, buildings collapsing one by one. The superintendent's house was demolished in 2023, deemed unsafe. But before it came down, Isabel returned one final time, leaving a small plaque in what had been the study. In memory of Thomas Harrington and all who gave their lives to these mines. The night after the house's demolition, several residents reported seeing a figure in old-fashioned clothes walking through town, visiting the mine entrance, then heading up into the mountains and finally disappearing. They thought it was someone in costume, but Isabel knew better. Harrington had waited for his prison to be destroyed before departing completely, ensuring no trace of his trapped existence remained. In the Appalachian mountains, abandoned mines and company towns dot the landscape, remnants of an industrial age that defined the region for generations. Some say that many of these places still hold the spirits of workers and managers who couldn't let go, who died with unfinished work and unfulfilled obligations. They remain at their posts, filing reports no one reads, managing workers who no longer exist, trapped by duty beyond death. Isabel's research is complete now, published and recognized. But she knows the truth behind the dry academic prose, that the mountains hold more than abandoned buildings and historical artifacts. They hold the souls of people who gave everything to these industries and couldn't move on when the industries died. She tells their stories now, documenting their lives and labors, ensuring they aren't forgotten. It's her work now, her obligation, and unlike Thomas Harrington, she knows when to stop, when to rest, when to let go. The mountains taught her that, through a ghost who couldn't learn it himself until someone finally gave him permission to depart. Story 8. The Trail That Leads Nowhere. Cameron West had been through hiking the Appalachian Trail for 4 months when he reached the North Carolina-Tennessee border in early October of 2023. An experienced backpacker from Seattle, he'd started at Springer Mountain in Georgia back in June, planning to reach Mount Katahdin in Maine by November. He'd covered over 1,300 miles, his body lean and hard from the constant walking, his gear streamlined to the essentials. On October 7th, Cameron camped at a shelter near the state line, sharing the space with 2 other thru-hikers. They discussed the trail ahead, the challenging terrain through the Smokies, the unpredictable weather this time of year. One hiker mentioned a rumor he'd heard from a section hiker, an unofficial side trail somewhere in this area that led to spectacular views, completely off the beaten path. The guy said it's marked with cairns, the hiker explained, rock piles, really old ones. Said it's worth the detour if you have time, but to be careful. It's not maintained, pretty rough going. Cameron was intrigued. He'd followed the white blazes religiously for months, but a brief exploration of something unknown appealed to him. The next morning he watched for the cairns as he hiked. Around noon he spotted them, stacked rocks about 3 feet high, positioned just off the main trail. A faint path led from them into dense forest. He checked his GPS, marking his position. The detour shouldn't take more than an hour or 2, and he had plenty of daylight. Cameron stepped off the Appalachian Trail, following the cairn-marked path into the woods. The trail was old, really old, not a maintained hiking path, but something that predated modern trail systems. It wound through ancient forest, past trees that must have been growing for centuries. Cameron found more cairns every 100 yards or so, confirming he was on the right track. The going was rough, just as the other hiker had warned, but manageable. After 30 minutes, the character of the forest changed. The trees grew closer together, their canopy thicker, blocking most sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably. Cameron's compass began acting strangely, the needle wavering instead of pointing steadily north. He noted this but continued, trusting the cairns to lead him. At 45 minutes, he should have reached whatever destination this trail led to. But the cairns kept going, leading him deeper into increasingly dense forest. Cameron checked his GPS. No signal, which wasn't unusual in heavy tree cover. He decided to give it another 15 minutes, then turned back if nothing appeared. The forest became even stranger. The trees here were twisted, their trunks spiraling in ways that seemed unnatural. Some grew horizontally before turning upward, creating bizarre arches. The undergrowth was different too. Plants Cameron didn't recognize, their leaves shaped oddly, colors slightly wrong. He'd studied eastern forest ecology. He should be able to identify these species, but he couldn't. Then he saw it. A vista opening up through the trees, exactly what he'd been promised. Cameron pushed through the final stretch of undergrowth and stepped into a clearing on a rocky outcrop. The view was spectacular, mountains stretching to the horizon in every direction, their ridges layered in shades of blue and purple fading into the distance. But something was wrong with the perspective. The mountains didn't quite line up with what Cameron knew of this area's topography. And the colors were off, too vivid, like a photograph with the saturation turned too high. He pulled out his phone to take pictures. No signal, but the camera worked. As he framed shots, he noticed something disturbing. His photos didn't match what he was seeing. The camera showed ordinary forest behind him, no clearing, no vista. Yet he was clearly standing on a rocky outcrop with spectacular views. Cameron lowered the phone, looking around more carefully. The clearing felt wrong, the way everything had felt wrong since entering this trail. The light was too bright, the air too still, the silence too complete. No bird calls, no insect sounds, just absolute quiet. He decided to leave immediately. But when he turned back toward the trail, he couldn't find it. The path he'd followed to reach this clearing had vanished. Dense forest surrounded the outcrop on all sides, no gap showing where he'd entered. Cameron fought down panic, thinking logically. He'd come from the east, based on the sun's position. He'd hike east, find the cairn trail, follow it back to the AT. Simple. But his compass was useless, the needle spinning slowly in complete circles. His phone's compass app did the same. He picked a direction and started walking, pushing through undergrowth, looking for cairns. After 20 minutes of difficult bushwhacking, he found himself back at the clearing, approaching it from a different angle. Impossible. He'd walked in a straight line away from it. Cameron tried again, this time marking his route by breaking branches every few steps. He walked for 30 minutes, maintaining what he thought was a straight line. But he ended up at the clearing again, entering from yet another direction. His broken branches were nowhere to be seen. The sun was setting now, dropping behind the mountains in a spectacular display that looked wrong. Too red, too fast, colors bleeding across the sky in ways that defied atmospheric physics. Cameron had no choice but to camp. He set up his tent in the clearing, getting a fire going for warmth and comfort. As darkness fell completely, the stars came out. Cameron stared up at them, growing increasingly disturbed. The constellations were wrong, not slightly off, but completely different. He knew the night sky well. You learned it hiking the AT, navigating by stars when necessary. But these patterns were alien, unfamiliar constellations he'd never seen despite decades of camping and hiking. He was somewhere else. Not just lost geographically, but displaced to somewhere that wasn't quite the same reality as the Appalachian mountains he'd been hiking through. Cameron forced himself to think rationally. This was impossible by normal physics, but clearly something impossible was happening. The trail he'd followed had led somewhere it shouldn't, to a place that existed outside normal space. Now he needed to find the way back. He remembered folklore about fairy paths and spirit roads, old legends from various cultures about trails that led to other realms. He'd always dismissed them as mythology. But what if the Cairn Trail was something like that? An ancient path created for purposes he couldn't understand, leading to places that shouldn't exist. The night was long and sleepless, Cameron jumping at every sound. And there were sounds now, things moving in the darkness just beyond his firelight. Not animal sounds, but stranger noises, whispers in languages he didn't recognize, footsteps that circled his camp without approaching, a distant singing that raised the hair on his neck. At dawn, or what passed for dawn in this place, the sun rising from the wrong direction, Cameron made a decision. The cairns had led him here. Maybe following them backward would lead him back. He searched the clearing's perimeter looking for cairns. He found one partially hidden by undergrowth, then another forming a line away from the clearing. These cairns looked different from the ones he'd followed, older, weathered, smooth, stones selected with clear intent. He began following them, hiking away from the clearing. The trail wound through the twisted forest, the cairns appearing regularly, but requiring careful searching. Cameron marked his route with torn pieces of his bandana, though he suspected they wouldn't help if he got turned around again. After 2 hours, the forest changed again. The trees began looking more normal, less twisted. The undergrowth became familiar species. The temperature rose. Cameron's hope grew. Maybe he was heading back toward normal reality. Then he encountered the other hikers. A group of 4 people sat resting beside the cairn trail, dressed in hiking gear from decades past. Canvas packs, leather boots, clothes from perhaps the 1960s or 70s. They looked exhausted, defeated. When they saw Cameron, their faces showed desperate hope. "Do you know the way out?" one asked, an older man with a thick beard. "We've been lost for, I don't know how long. Days? Weeks?" Cameron approached carefully. "How did you get here?" "Followed cairns off the AT. We were curious, wanted to see where they led. That was a mistake. A terrible mistake." The others nodded, their eyes haunted. A young woman spoke. "This place doesn't follow rules. Time doesn't work right. We've been trying to find the way back, but the trail just loops. We keep finding the clearing, over and over." "The clearing with the vista?" Cameron asked. "Yes, you've seen it. Did you find a way out from there?" "I followed cairns away from it. These cairns." Cameron pointed at the trail markers. The bearded man shook his head. "We tried that. These cairns lead back to the clearing just like everything else. This place is a maze with no exit. We're trapped." Cameron felt his hope crumbling. But something occurred to him. "You said you've been here days or weeks, but your clothes, your gear, it's from the 70s at least. What year did you enter?" The group exchanged glances. The young woman answered, 1973, October. We were college students, section hiking during fall break. 50 years. They'd been here 50 years, but looked like they'd aged maybe a week. Time worked differently in this place, running slower than in the normal world. Cameron's mind reeled at the implications. "Others have come through over the years," an Asian man in the group said. "We've seen them, met a few. Most give up after a while, sit down in the clearing and just stop. We found remains there. Decades-old remains, but the people died recently, if you know what I mean." Cameron refused to accept this fate. He pulled out his journal, starting to map everything he knew. The clearing was a central point. Cairn trails led to and from it, but they looped back. Traditional navigation didn't work. Compasses failed, GPS was useless, the stars were wrong. But there had to be a pattern, a logic to this place, even if it operated under different rules. He studied the cairns themselves, really examining them. The stones were deliberately selected, specific types arranged in specific ways. Some cairns had markings, faint scratches that might be symbols or might be natural weathering. Cameron photographed everything, looking for patterns. The 1973 hikers watched him work, their hope long since burned out. They'd tried everything, they said. Nothing worked. The place was inescapable, a trap that had caught them and wouldn't let go. But Cameron noticed something they'd missed, perhaps because they'd been here so long they'd stopped really seeing. The marked cairns and the unmarked cairns were different. The old, weathered cairns that led from the clearing had marks, deliberate scratches forming crude arrows. Most pointed forward along the trail. But one cairn he examined had an arrow pointing perpendicular to the trail, into dense forest with no visible path. "Have you tried following the arrows on the cairns?" Cameron asked. The group looked confused. "What arrows?" Cameron showed them the scratches. To his eyes, they clearly formed directional marks. But the other hikers couldn't see them even when he traced the patterns with his finger. After 50 years in this place, they'd lost the ability to perceive these markers. Cameron wondered if it was a protection, a final cruelty. The escape route was marked, but those who'd been trapped too long could no longer see it. He made a decision. "I'm following these arrows. You can come with me or stay here." The bearded man shook his head. "We'll stay. We're tired. So tired. You go. Maybe you'll make it." Cameron felt guilty leaving them, but knew he couldn't force them to follow. He gathered his gear and headed in the direction the perpendicular arrow indicated, pushing into pathless forest. Behind him, the 1973 hikers remained sitting, already looking like they'd been there forever. The forest was dense and difficult, no trail visible. But Cameron found more cairns, widely spaced, each with arrow scratches pointing onward. He followed them for hours, losing track of time in this place where time didn't run correctly. The forest changed constantly, thick pine, then deciduous trees, then back to twisted growth that hurt to look at. Finally, he saw light ahead, real daylight with normal color. Cameron pushed through a final thicket and stumbled onto a maintained trail with white blazes painted on trees. The Appalachian Trail. He'd found his way back. He collapsed on the trail, laughing and crying simultaneously. His GPS flickered to life, showing his position. According to the timestamp, he'd been gone 3 hours, though it had felt like 2 days. His phone had dozens of missed messages, the signal returning all at once. Cameron hiked north rapidly, wanting distance from whatever that place had been. At the next shelter, he met other through hikers and asked if they'd heard about a cairn-marked side trail near here. "Yeah," one hiker said. "But everyone says to avoid it. People have gotten lost there. A couple of hikers went missing back in the 70s, never found. Park Service discourages anyone from following those cairns." Cameron didn't tell them he'd followed the trail and escaped. He didn't mention the people still trapped there, couldn't explain what he'd experienced. It sounded insane even to him, and he'd lived through it. He finished his through hike, reaching Mount Katahdin in early November, but the experience haunted him. After returning home, he researched obsessively, finding scattered references to the Cairn Trail in old hiking forums and local legends. A few people mentioned entering it and escaping quickly, sensing danger. Others never emerged. Most disturbing were historical records he found in Tennessee library archives. Multiple disappearances over decades, all in the same area, people last seen near the state line. Some were found eventually wandering out of the forest days later with confused stories about getting turned around. But they were changed. Family members reported personality shifts, memory problems, difficulty readjusting to normal life. And some were never found at all. Cameron counted 17 documented disappearances spanning from 1958 to 2023. 17 people who'd followed the cairns and never returned, lost in a place that existed beside the normal world but separate from it. He tried to report what he'd experienced to park authorities, suggesting they demolish the cairns, block the trail entrance. But without specific locations or proof, his claims were dismissed as trail hallucinations, a known phenomenon where exhausted hikers experienced confusion and false memories. Cameron knows the truth, though. Somewhere in the mountains along the North Carolina-Tennessee border, a trail marked with ancient cairns leads to a place where the rules of reality break down. The 1973 hikers are still there, aging slowly in a timeless forest, watching others arrive and fail to escape. The clearing waits, its impossible vista drawing in the curious. And the cairns remain, marking a path that shouldn't exist, built by people unknown for purposes unknowable. Sometimes Cameron thinks about going back, about trying to guide the trapped hikers out using the arrow markings they can no longer see. But he knows that's how it gets you, drawing you back in, making you feel responsible until you too become another lost soul waiting in the clearing. The mountains claimed those people long ago, and the mountains don't give back what they've taken. He content himself with warning other hikers, posting anonymously on trail forums. If you see cairns near the NCTN border, don't follow them. No matter how curious you are, no matter what views they promise, they lead nowhere good. The trail marked with stone ends in a place where you can't find your way home. Most dismiss his warnings as superstition, but a few listen, a few stay on the white-blazed path and ignore the ancient cairns. Cameron hopes it's enough. The Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,000 miles through some of the oldest mountains on Earth, and in places those mountains remember older times, stranger realities. The Cairn Trail is one such place, a door that swings only one way, leading hikers into a beautiful trap from which escape requires seeing what those who've been trapped too long can no longer perceive. Cameron finished his through hike and will never return to those mountains. But he knows the cairns remain, waiting patiently for the next curious hiker to step off the safe, marked trail and follow them into the twisted forest. The clearing waits with its impossible views. And somewhere in that timeless place, the 1973 hikers sit beside the trail, too exhausted to continue, watching the years pass like days while the normal world ages without them, trapped forever in an October that never ends. Story 9. The family that vanished from their farm. Detective Rachel Holbrook had been with the Virginia State Police for 12 years when she caught the Mercer case in January of 2023. A family of 4 had simply vanished from their remote farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Parents John and Patricia Mercer, their teenage children Emma and Luke. Neighbors reported not seeing them for over a week, which was unusual for the close-knit rural community. Rachel drove out to the property on a gray January morning, accompanied by Deputy Sheriff Tom Whitfield, who knew the family well. The farm sat in a narrow valley accessible by a single gravel road that wound 3 miles from the nearest paved highway. 100-year-old oaks surrounded the property, and steep ridges enclosed the valley on all sides. Good people, Whitfield said as they approached. John worked construction in Harrisonburg. Patricia homeschooled the kids. They kept to themselves mostly, but friendly enough. Can't imagine them just leaving. The farmhouse was a simple 2-story structure, white paint peeling, surrounded by a barn, chicken coop, and various outbuildings. Rachel noted immediately that everything looked normal, no signs of struggle, no obvious disturbances. They knocked, got no answer, and entered through the unlocked door. Inside, the scene was eerily ordinary. Breakfast dishes sat on the kitchen table, food still on the plates, partially eaten. Chairs were pushed back as if the family had stood up mid-meal. Coffee in the mugs was moldy, indicating the meal had been abandoned at least a week earlier. but there were no signs of panic or forced departure. Rachel walked through the house systematically. Beds were made, clothes hung in closets. Personal items, wallets, phones, keys, sat on dressers and nightstands. The family's 2 vehicles remained in the driveway. Nothing appeared missing except the family themselves. "It's like they just stood up from breakfast and walked out," Whitfield observed, echoing Rachel's thoughts. They checked the outbuildings. The barn contained a tractor, tools, stored hay. Chickens wandered the coop, alive but clearly unfed for days. The family dog, a border collie named Max, was found in his kennel, alive but emaciated. Someone had left him food and water, enough for a few days, but not a week. Rachel organized a search, bringing in teams to comb the valley and surrounding ridges. The terrain was rough, full of hollows and dense forest. Volunteers from neighboring farms joined, people who knew the Mercers and wanted to help. They searched for 3 days, finding nothing. No bodies, no tracks, no indications of where the family had gone. What they did find puzzled Rachel. At various points around the property's perimeter, they discovered markings, symbols carved into trees roughly at chest height. The carvings looked old, weathered gray, but the wood beneath showed they'd been cut relatively recently, probably within the past year. The symbols were consistent. Circles with radiating lines like crude suns and crosses with equal arms. "Warding symbols," an elderly volunteer named Mrs. Chen said when Rachel showed her photos. "My grandmother was from the old country, China. She made marks like these to ward off evil spirits. Different cultures have different symbols, but the purpose is the same: protection." "Protection from what?" Mrs. Chen shrugged. "Whatever frightened them enough to carve symbols all around their property." Rachel interviewed neighbors extensively. Several mentioned that the Mercers had become increasingly anxious over the past 6 months. Patricia had stopped attending church gatherings. John had been seen walking the property line at odd hours. Emma had told a friend that her parents were afraid of something in the woods, though she didn't know what. One neighbor, Carl Peterson, mentioned something particularly disturbing. "Last fall, October maybe, Patricia came to our place late one night. She was shaking, nearly hysterical. Said something had been watching their house from the tree line, something that wasn't human. We drove over with her to check, but saw nothing. Figured it was an animal, maybe a bear, but Patricia insisted it walked on 2 legs, stood 7 or 8 feet tall, and made sounds like it was trying to talk." Rachel checked with Fish and Game authorities. No large predators had been reported in the area. Black bears were common but rarely approached occupied structures, and they certainly didn't stand 8 feet tall or attempt vocalization resembling speech. She returned to the farm alone one evening, walking the property as the sun set. The valley felt oppressive, shadows deepening quickly as mountains blocked the light. Rachel understood why the family might have felt isolated, even threatened, living in such a remote location. But feeling threatened and vanishing without a trace were different things. As darkness fell, Rachel used a powerful flashlight to examine the tree line where Patricia had reported seeing something. The forest was dense, providing countless hiding places. Then she found them. Tracks. Not human, not any animal she recognized. They were roughly foot-shaped but larger, maybe 18 inches long, pressed deep into mud near a stream. The prints had 5 toes but were elongated with what looked like claw marks. Rachel photographed and measured everything, making casts of the clearest prints. Whatever had made these tracks was heavy and bipedal. She followed the track line, finding they circled the property, staying just inside the tree line, as if the creature had been observing the house from the woods. The tracks were everywhere, dozens of them, indicating repeated visits over time. One set of tracks led away from the property, heading up into the ridges. Rachel followed them for a quarter-mile, her flashlight beam revealing more prints until they ended at a rocky outcrop. No more tracks beyond that point, just bare stone. The creature had either climbed the rock face or stopped existing. Unnerved, Rachel returned to her car. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw something standing at the edge of the tree line behind the house. Tall, impossibly tall, silhouetted against the dark forest. She slammed on the brakes, looking back. Nothing there, just shadows and trees. The investigation stalled. Without bodies or evidence of foul play, the case couldn't progress. The Mercers were listed as missing persons, their faces added to databases and posters. Months passed with no leads, no sightings, nothing. Rachel refused to close the case but had nowhere else to look. Then in August of 2023, 7 months after the family's disappearance, a hiker found something on a remote trail 15 miles from the Mercer farm. It was Emma Mercer's jacket, caught on a branch, easily identifiable by a distinctive patch she'd sewn on. The location made no sense. The family had no reason to be that far from their property, and the terrain between was extremely difficult. Rachel organized another search, focusing on the area where the jacket was found. After 2 days, they discovered Luke Mercer's backpack hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground. No way he'd hung it there deliberately. And inside the backpack, they found Luke's journal. The entries were disturbing. Luke had been documenting what his family experienced, writing almost daily since the previous summer. According to the journal, it started with sounds. Footsteps around the house at night, scratching at walls. Voices calling their names in voices that sounded almost human but not quite right. By fall, the family was seeing it. A creature that watched them from the woods, tall and thin, covered in something that might have been dark hair or bark. It never approached closely, just observed, always present at dusk and dawn. John tried photographing it, but the images never showed anything clear, just shadows and suggestion. The family considered leaving, but Patricia had inherited the farm from her grandmother. It was their home, their livelihood. They decided to stay, creating the ward symbols to protect themselves. For a while, it seemed to work. The creature stayed back, remaining at the tree line. But it learned. Luke described how the creature began mimicking them, standing like they stood, moving like they moved, even attempting to form words and voices that sounded like distorted recordings of family members. It was studying them, learning humanity. The final entries from early January were frantic. The creature had crossed the ward line, approaching the house directly. It stood outside windows, pressing against glass, its face nearly human but wrong in every detail. The family had nowhere to run. The valley was snowed in, the gravel road impassable. The last entry dated January 12th, the day before the family vanished. It's at the door now, has been for hours. Dad won't let us open it, but I think it's learning how doors work. Mom is praying. Emma is crying. I don't know what it wants with us, but I think it's going to get in tonight, and I don't think we can stop it. If someone finds this, please look for us. The entry ended mid-sentence, a pencil line trailing off the page. Rachel felt sick reading it. But it was evidence, proof that something had been threatening this family, even if that something seemed impossible. She brought in anthropologists, wildlife biologists, cryptozoologists, anyone who might explain what the Mercers had encountered. The experts were divided. Some suggested the family had experienced shared delusion, folie à famille, driven by isolation and fear. Others pointed to the physical evidence, the tracks, the descriptions, suggesting an unknown primate species, perhaps related to reported Sasquatch sightings. A few speculated more wildly about interdimensional beings or feral humans living deep in the mountains. Rachel returned to the farm repeatedly, always at dusk, watching the tree line. She never saw the creature, but she felt watched, that primal sensation of unseen eyes. The property was sold eventually, bought by developers planning to build vacation cabins, but construction crews refused to work there after equipment kept malfunctioning and workers reported seeing a tall figure in the woods. The development was abandoned. The Mercer house stands empty now, slowly decaying. Hunters and hikers avoid the valley, deterred by the oppressive atmosphere and persistent rumors. Local legend has built around the case, the family that vanished, taken by something in the woods. Rachel never solved it. The Mercers were never found, never declared dead without bodies. But 3 years later, in September of 2026, a different hiker found something else. Patricia Mercer's wedding ring, placed deliberately on a flat rock near a stream, 20 miles from the farm. Next to it were more rings, dozens of them, different styles from different eras arranged in concentric circles. Each ring represented a person, Rachel realized. People who disappeared in these mountains over decades, perhaps centuries. The creature, whatever it was, had been collecting them, taking people from the mountains, keeping souvenirs. The Mercers were just the most recent. DNA testing matched several rings to unsolved missing persons cases spanning back to the 1960s. Rachel realized the scope was far larger than one family. Something lived in these mountains, something that had been taking people for a very long time, studying them, learning from them. The Mercers had simply been unlucky enough to settle within its territory, close enough to draw its attention. Authorities tried to organize a comprehensive search of the area where the rings were found. But the terrain was impossible. Vast stretches of roadless wilderness, cave systems barely explored, hollows so remote they appeared on no maps. Whatever took the Mercers could be anywhere in millions of acres of mountain forest. The case remains open. Rachel retired from the state police but still monitors reports from the region. People continue to disappear occasionally. Hikers, hunters, local residents. Most are found eventually. But some aren't. And sometimes in the most remote areas people report seeing it. The tall figure that watches from the trees. Learning, mimicking, waiting. The ward symbols the Mercers carved didn't save them, but others have adopted the practice. Hikers in the area sometimes mark their campsites with similar symbols, hoping for protection against something that probably doesn't exist but might. The Blue Ridge Mountains are vast and old, holding secrets in their hollows and caves. Some of those secrets are dangerous, predatory, patient. Rachel thinks about the Mercers often, about that breakfast abandoned mid-meal, about Luke's terrified journal entries, about rings arranged on a rock like trophies. She thinks about how the family tried to protect themselves and failed, how isolation in the mountains can leave you vulnerable to things that don't appear in field guides or official reports. Somewhere in those mountains she believes the Mercers might still exist. Alive or dead, she doesn't know. But evidence suggests the creature that took them keeps its victims somehow, holds them in places undiscovered for purposes unknown. The rings prove it's been doing this for decades. The Mercers are just the ones we know about, the ones who left behind enough evidence to prove something terrible happened. The farmhouse stands empty in its valley, windows dark, wards carved futilely around its perimeter. And in the tree line, patient and eternal. Something watches still, waiting for the next family to settle too close, the next person to wander too deep. The Appalachian Mountains have always been places of mystery and danger, where civilization ends and older rules apply. The Mercers discovered that truth too late, and their story remains unfinished, their fate unknown, their memory a warning that sometimes the old fears, the fear of things in the woods, of being watched, of predators more cunning than any natural animal, are justified. Sometimes the monsters are real. Story 10. The photographer who captured too much. Melissa Chang had built her photography career on capturing Appalachian landscapes, the austere beauty of ancient mountains, the play of light through morning mist, abandoned structures reclaimed by nature. Her Instagram had 200,000 followers. Her prints sold in galleries across the East Coast. In November of 2022, she embarked on an ambitious project, photographing every section of the Blue Ridge Parkway during golden hour, creating a comprehensive visual documentation of America's favorite scenic drive. She'd been working on the project for 2 weeks, driving the parkway each day, setting up her equipment at carefully scouted locations, waiting for perfect light. Her photographs were stunning, mountains layered into infinity, fog-filling valleys, autumn colors blazing against evergreen slopes. But on November 17th, shooting near milepost 294 in North Carolina, Melissa captured something in a photo that she hadn't seen with her naked eye. The image was standard for her work. A vista looking west, mountains fading into the distance, late afternoon sun painting everything golden. But when she reviewed it on her camera's screen, there was a figure visible in the mid-ground standing on a distant ridge. The figure was human-shaped but wrong, too tall, proportions distorted, standing impossibly still. Melissa hadn't noticed anyone on that ridge when she shot the image. She looked up now, scanning the landscape through her telephoto lens. The ridge was empty. But in her camera, in the image she'd captured seconds earlier, the figure remained clearly visible. She took another photo of the same scene. Again, the figure appeared, but in a slightly different position, as if it had moved between shots. Melissa felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. She was alone on this pullout, miles from other visitors, and something was appearing in her photographs that wasn't visible to her eyes. She packed her equipment quickly, deciding to move to a different location. But as she drove south on the parkway, stopping at several overlooks, the figure kept appearing in her images. Always in the distance, always at the edge of the frame, but consistently present. Different positions, different poses, but unmistakably the same entity. By the time evening fell, Melissa had dozens of photos containing the figure. She returned to her cabin in Asheville, dumping all the images onto her laptop for detailed examination. Zooming in on the figure revealed disturbing details. It appeared to be humanoid, but with elongated limbs and fingers. Its face, if it had one, obscured by distance and image resolution. In some photos, it stood motionless. In others, it seemed to be moving, a blur of motion that suggested unnatural speed. Most disturbing was a pattern Melissa noticed when arranging the photos chronologically. The figure wasn't random. It was getting closer with each image, moving from distant ridges to nearer slopes, approaching the parkway itself, approaching her. Melissa searched online for explanations. Camera artifacts, lens flares, pareidolia, seeing patterns in random data. But the figure was too consistent, too detailed. It appeared in different lighting conditions, from different angles, always solid and three-dimensional. She posted one of the images to a photography forum, asking if anyone could identify what she'd captured. Responses were mixed. Some claimed it was clearly photoshopped. Others suggested a hiker in strange clothing. A few made jokes about Bigfoot. But one response caught her attention. "I've seen similar things in my landscape photos from Appalachia. Figures that appear in images but weren't visible when shooting. My advice, stop photographing. Whatever it is, your camera is seeing it in a way human eyes can't, and that attention draws it closer." "I learned that the hard way," Melissa messaged the user privately, getting a chilling response. The photographer, someone named Marcus, explained that 3 years earlier he'd been shooting in the Smokies when figures started appearing in his images. Like Melissa, he'd captured dozens of photos before realizing the entity was approaching. When it got close enough to appear in the immediate foreground of his images, directly visible rather than distant, it crossed over somehow, began manifesting in physical reality. "It followed me," Marcus wrote. "I could see it then with my eyes, not just through the camera. Wherever I went, it was there, watching. I had to stop photography completely, destroy all the images I'd taken. Eventually it faded away, but I'll never shoot landscapes again. The camera showed me something I wasn't meant to see. And once seen, it noticed me noticing." Melissa wanted to dismiss this as nonsense, but Marcus sent her his photos. They showed the exact same pattern, a tall, distorted figure appearing progressively closer over a series of images. His final photos, taken in his own home apparently, showed the figure standing in his yard, visible through a window. The image quality was high enough that Melissa could see its face in this one. Blank and smooth like a mannequin with deep hollows where eyes should be. She didn't sleep that night, staying awake reviewing every image on her camera and laptop. The figure appeared in 43 photos total, spanning 3 days of shooting. And it was definitely closer in the most recent images, having moved from distant ridges to lower slopes visible from parkway overlooks. The next morning, Melissa decided to confront this directly. She drove back to the parkway, to the first location where the figure had appeared. She set up her camera and took a deliberate photo, reviewing it immediately. The figure was there, closer now, standing in a meadow perhaps a quarter-mile away. Melissa shouldered her camera and hiked toward the meadow, following a trail that led in that direction. The terrain was rough, but she was determined to reach the spot where the figure appeared in her photos. Maybe it was just a person, someone hiking who happened to be in her shots. She'd feel foolish, but at least she'd know. She reached the meadow after 30 minutes of hiking. It was empty. Just grass and scattered trees, no sign anyone had been there. Melissa took another photo from this position, capturing the surrounding landscape. Reviewing the image, her breath caught. The figure was now behind her, visible in the background, standing where she'd been shooting from earlier. It had moved, was continuing to move, always positioning itself in her photographs no matter where she went. Fear finally overrode Melissa's curiosity. She ran back to the parkway, reaching her car and driving away quickly. That evening, she downloaded the day's images with shaking hands. The figure appeared in all of them, including shots she'd taken while fleeing, as if it had been following her retreat. In the final image, a rushed shot from her car as she drove away, the figure stood at the pullout where her car had been parked, directly facing the camera despite being hundreds of yards away. And even through distance and motion blur, she could see details. Hands with too many fingers. A body that didn't quite move correctly, that same blank face that Marcus's photos had shown. Melissa made a decision. She would delete everything, every image containing the figure, even the beautiful landscape shots mixed with them. She started with her camera's memory card, erasing files one by one. But as she deleted images, her computer screen flickered. The deleted photos reappeared, thumbnails showing the figure had moved again, now closer in each restored image. She tried reformatting the entire card. The computer froze, screen filling with static. When it cleared, dozens of new images appeared in her library, photos she hadn't taken, showing her apartment from outside, views through her windows, the figure visible in the street below her building. Melissa grabbed her laptop, about to smash it, when she realized the problem wasn't the technology. It was the documentation. By photographing the entity, she'd created a connection. The images were anchors, linking it to her reality. Deleting them wasn't enough. They existed in the digital realm somehow, persistent, and through them it was finding her. She contacted Marcus again, desperately asking what he'd done. His response was immediate. You have to stop creating images entirely. Destroy the camera, the memory cards, any device that held the photos. Burn them if possible. Complete physical destruction. The entity exists in a state where it can be captured by cameras but not fully perceived by human senses. Photographs create bridges between its reality and ours. Delete all your cloud backups, your social media posts, everything. Sever all connections. I'm sorry you're going through this. I know how terrifying it is. Melissa worked through the night, deleting her Instagram account, her website, her cloud storage. She wiped her laptop completely, then used a hammer to destroy its hard drive. She smashed her camera, expensive professional equipment, grinding the pieces until the electronics were pulverized. Memory cards went into a fire she built in her apartment's fireplace, melting them to useless plastic. She felt insane doing it, destroying her career, her life's work. But the alternative was worse. If Marcus was right, if creating images strengthened the connection, then every photo she took brought this thing closer to full manifestation in her reality. For 3 days, she didn't use any camera, didn't take a single image. She lived in fear, jumping at shadows, seeing the figure's blank face in every reflection. She covered her mirrors, her windows, anything that might show a reflection and thus create a kind of image. On the 4th day, she risked a glance at her phone, a new one, never used for photography. No strange images appeared. She ventured outside, looking at the world directly rather than through a lens. Everything seemed normal, the weight of being watched finally lifting. Melissa never photographed professionally again. The experience broke something in her. The joy of capturing light and landscape replaced by terror of what else she might capture. She took a job in graphic design, working only with illustrations and vector art, never photographs. But she monitored photography forums obsessively, watching for others who reported similar experiences. She found them occasionally, landscape photographers who'd captured figures in their images, entities that appeared in cameras but not to naked eyes. Most dismissed the experiences as technical glitches. A few, like her, realized the truth and abandoned photography. And some posted final, terrified messages before disappearing from online platforms entirely. One such photographer based in Tennessee posted a series of images in October 2023 that Melissa recognized immediately. The same entity she'd photographed, but in his images it was fully visible, standing in the immediate foreground, face pressed close to the lens. His caption read, "It's at my door. I can see it without the camera now. I think I let it in by photographing it too much. Don't make my mistake." He never posted again. Local news reported him missing from his home. No signs of struggle, just gone. Melissa knew what had happened, understood that he'd photographed it until it became real enough to take him. She keeps one image hidden in a safe deposit box. A print of that first photo from the parkway, the figure distant on its ridge. She considers it a warning, proof that some things exist just beyond human perception, visible only through technology that captures light in ways eyes don't. The camera had shown her something ancient and predatory, something that used images as bridges between its reality and ours. The Appalachian mountains hold many secrets, but this one is particularly insidious. The entity, she never learned its name or nature, exists in a twilight state, not quite physical, not quite immaterial. Cameras, especially digital cameras capturing thousands of details invisible to human perception, can detect it. And once detected, once acknowledged through images, it gains strength, drawing closer, feeding on the attention until it can finally manifest completely. Melissa wonders how many missing persons cases might be explained by this phenomenon. How many photographers, professional and amateur, might have captured something they shouldn't. created connections they didn't understand, and paid the ultimate price when the photographed became the photographer. She'll never know. What she does know is that the mountains are home to things that predate humanity, entities that exist in states our senses can't fully perceive. Technology bridges that gap sometimes, showing us what we're better off not seeing. The camera was invented to capture light and preserve moments. But in the Appalachian wilderness, it captures something else. Presences that notice being noticed, that move from the background to the foreground, from the photograph to the physical, from observed to observer. Melissa Chang no longer creates images, but the image of that blank-faced figure standing on its ridge remains burned into her memory, more permanent than any photograph. She knows it's still out there, waiting in the mountains, invisible to eyes but present in ways cameras can capture. And she knows that somewhere, someone else is probably photographing landscapes in those same mountains right now, unknowingly documenting something they shouldn't, creating bridges they can't destroy, summoning something that watches through lenses and emerges through photographs, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment when it can step fully into our reality and claim those who dared to capture its image. The mountains keep their secrets, but cameras reveal them, and some revelations once made cannot be undone. The shutter clicks, the image forms, and something distant moves a little closer, drawn by the act of observation. Approaching through the frames, coming for the photographer who saw too much and documented their own doom.